Good morning. We are actually going to get started. I know there's some delays on the trains today, but I don't want to keep you all waiting anymore. So good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Frampton Tolbert. I'm HDC's new executive director, and welcome to HDC's annual preservation conference, Reframing the Narrative, Equity, Affordable Housing, and Cultural Landmarks. Many of you know me from my previous time at HDC, and I'm so pleased to be back to work with you to lead all of you to lead the organization forward. As you may know, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York's historic and cultural neighborhoods. Our mission is to ensure the preservation of significant neighborhoods, buildings, and public spaces, uphold the integrity of New York City's landmarks law, and further the preservation ethic. This is a challenging time, both in the world in general and within preservation. New York City has a new mayoral administration and largely new city council, and we'll be very excited to hear from one of our new city council members today. Over the past few tough years, development has kept the same pace while landmark designation has slowed. Communities are still recovering from the pandemic and continue to deal with many of the impacts to the built environment from the loss of many historic and culturally significant small businesses and some communities' own inability to advocate for community-based agendas on development and preservation in their neighborhoods in the face of massive real estate dollars and city-led rezonings. But today we want to focus on the positive stories around preservation. There's an opportunity today and moving forward to reframe the narrative around preservation and show how we can work together with advocates in affordable housing, environmental justice, and social justice spaces to make sure preservation is recognized as part of the solution for New York City and gain more support and recognition for its value to the lives of New Yorkers. Today, our amazing roster of speakers and panelists will share positive stories of preservation, the work they are doing to increase our appreciation of significant cultural sites, and pushing to make sure that preservation community is more equitable, both in the way that we work as a field, but also in what we preserve and how we preserve it. I'm hoping this is just the beginning from these conversations, and HDC and others can carry them forward in our programming and other initiatives. One way we plan to do this is a symposium of case studies on projects that have successfully combined both preservation and affordable housing that we'll be doing this fall, targeted to developers, architects, and other practitioners to get them to see the potential of preservation and affordable housing in New York City. Following the conference over the next month, HDC will also have 5 in-person and virtual walking tours that further explore the topics we discussed today. We'll have a tour of the Melrose Community Renewal area of the Bronx, a look at food history in Gansevoort Market, sites of cultural significance in East Harlem and Washington Heights, and a virtual walkthrough of some historic NYCHA campuses. There is also a flyer on your chair with more information, and we hope you'll sign up for all of those tours. And you also have on your chairs the bios for today's speakers. We also have next Wednesday a free Zoom program on the landmarks provision of hardship and the current application to demolish West Park Presbyterian Church on the Upper West Side. We hope you'll attend this very important meeting to stop the demolition of that church. And we are also returning to our Grassroots Preservation Awards. We'll be having our first outdoor Grassroots Preservation Awards in several years on June 28th. So we hope you'll save the date for that at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, celebrating those individuals and groups who have made a positive difference in preserving our communities. A few special thanks and housekeeping notes before we move into our keynote discussion. A huge thank you to HDC staff in planning this event, Helen Freeman, Michelle Arbalou, and Diego Roballo, as well as the Program and Events Committee of the HDC Board. Also, a special thanks to our supporters of this event, including the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. Finally, we ask you for your understanding as we navigate today's in-person event, our first event in-person event in over 2 years. Please keep your masks on and join us. And we will not be serving any food or drink at this event. With that, I'm going to start our discussion. And I'm going to introduce our keynote, the person joining us for our keynote today, Member Christopher Marte, who is representing the district we are sitting in right now. We'll discuss some of the themes from today's presentations, including reframing the narrative around preservation and how coalition building can create a unified community-based vision for New York City. Following my conversation with Member Marte, we'll have a special presentation by Rachel Robinson, Director of Preservation at Providence Preservation Society, who will share PPS's 2021 strategic plan. Then we'll have 2 panels, one that touches on the intersection of preservation, affordable housing, and land use, and one on sites of cultural significance. So with that, I'm going to introduce Councilmember Marte and start our conversation. We are lucky to be joined by Councilmember Marte today, who represents District 1, where we're sitting, which includes Battery Park City, Civic Center, Chinatown, Financial District, Little Italy, the Lower East Side, NoHo, Soho, South Street Seaport, South Village, Tribeca, and Washington Square. The councilmember was very familiar with many of the issues and themes we'll be discussing today. He was born and raised on the Lower East Side, where his dad owned a bodega. Eventually, his dad's store had to close because of rent hikes, and he started to see the community he loved get torn apart by luxury development and corrupt politicians. He decided to take action. He co-founded 2 community gardens in NYCHA while the state refused to fund their repairs. He volunteered at the Bowery Mission as he saw more and more affordable housing get converted into luxury condos. It was through this work that he learned so many of our problems came from the same source. We had elected officials who lined their pocket with real estate money and who prioritized political gain over people. So he decided to run for city council. Welcome to Councilmember Christopher Marte. Thank you again for joining us today. We're excited to have you here. Just to start off, can you give today's attendees some context on the land use issues you've been involved with in your district, both before and after being elected?
Cool. I'll just start with the first. Oh, it's pretty loud. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start with the first preservation fight that I was actually engaged in. It was actually, I was around a senior in high school, and my dad and churchgoers at Nativity Church were trying to preserve a beautiful church that heroes like Dorothy Day where the Catholic worker was, founded and partnered with. And my dad and my family have been parishioners there for decades. Originally, it was an old Italian community church. It eventually became a Dominican Central American church. And the archdiocese said that the church wasn't making enough money to sustain itself. So people in the community started organizing and mobilizing. My dad even had me do the accounting for the church. And one thing that we saw was that the church was financially sustainable, but the archdiocese continued to demand to close it. And this is when I first engaged with preservationists, talking about how unique this church was and historical context to the Lower East Side and the East Village. And even though we continued to fight and press on, the archdiocese decided to close. They decided to close not for affordable housing, which is one of the things community members were active for. They decided to close to get the biggest bang for their buck. And now what we're going to see there soon is just luxury condos. And we've seen that practice throughout New York City. That opened up my eyes to how neighborhoods transform because of profit. And what happened to that community? It disappeared. It used to be an extremely strong Hispanic community, Italian community that went to that church. And once it closed, members went to other churches nearby. People went to St. Mary's, Holy Redeemer, St. Patrick Basilica, and that community just died. And it really illustrated the point of why we have to continue to fight to preserve it. And who are we preserving this for?
Great, thank you. Related to that, and probably building on that, what do you see as some of the biggest land use issues right now as you're starting your term going forward, and threats to your district and citywide?
Yeah, so I believe my district has been in hyper gentrification and displacement mode for the past decade. The former administration, I feel like their favorite area to develop was Lower Manhattan. Whether we saw the latest rezoning with Governor's Island, with the Seaport, the recent Soho NoHo upzoning, and the lack of attention to put protective zoning in areas like the Lower East Side and Chinatown, one of the last working class communities, I feel like, in south of 125th Street. And, we inherit a lot of these decisions that were made without our input, but we're pushing back as much as we can. Recently this year, we were able to get a veto to help artists remain in place in Soho and NoHo. We're actively looking at lawsuits in the Seaport. We're working with people in Governor's Island to make sure that we have the less damaging development project there. And so there's a lot, but I feel like it's really symbolic of, the trajectory of the city. But with all these massive projects, it gives me a lot of hope, because we've been seeing communities really come together, especially downtown. We've seen, anti-displacement groups like the Coalition to Protect Chinatown Lower East Side work with Barrio Alliance of Neighbors, a preservation group, with the Broadway Resident Coalition, which is the Soho NoHo group, with Save Our Seaport. And one thing we've seen in all these fights is that we all have a common enemy. And so why are we fighting it on a one-off basis? And that really became kind of like the theme of our campaign. It's like, no matter how diverse this community is, we all know what the enemy is, and it's mostly these massive real estate developers that want to pit us against each other and have their will.
Well, one way the new administration seems to be changing a little bit is that recently the new city planning chair, Dan Garodnick, stated that an overarching goal of his commission and agency is to engage every neighborhood in the city in land use talks and ease the experience of rezoning applicants. How can we get city agencies and the mayoral administration to understand the value of grassroots preservation and true community engagement and make sure this pledge is not just a lip service or after the fact?
Well, we're trying to take full advantage of that statement. From day one in this office, our goal was to pass the Chinatown Working Group Plan. The Chinatown Working Group Plan is a community-based rezoning plan that would protect the Lower East Side and Chinatown from speculation and from displacement. How does it do that? In two ways. Simply two ways. Is a lot to go into, but it's putting height limitations so we don't see One Manhattan Square, the X Tower, go up, or the 4 proposed developments along the Two Bridges area, but also adding anti-harassment clauses and anti-demolition clauses, which can really unify our community. And so, people have been working on this plan for almost a decade now. And it's because of organizers and activists really making sure that the narrative never goes away, that we're in such a unique position where we have a council office, we have the community, and now we have the chair of city planning that wants to engage in a community-based rezoning. And so we're like, all right, let's take this on. And so we have met with Dan and his team, and so far they've been engaging with us on how to move forward.
From the other side of that, I know this is an issue that's really important to you. Can you talk a little bit about building those strong community coalitions for success to work with the city agencies and commissions, especially given the amount of money that developers and speculators have?
Yeah, developers, we all know it, have money. But if we are able to build coalition, we have people. And at the end of the day, whether you're a bureaucrat or an elected official, you're going to listen to people if there's enough of them and they're constantly being loud and bringing up the same thing. And that's what we saw that was successful with the Brooklyn Botanical Garden fight, that no one thought they had an opportunity, but they just never stopped fighting. Crown Heights Tenants Union was partnering up with green activists to make sure that the conversation was never lost, and how, by coming together and having a common enemy at that developer, it really brought every single part of that neighborhood together, whether it was the Caribbean African American community, people who live in Prospect Heights. It really showed that when you work together and you never stop, you can actually achieve something. And we started seeing that downtown, one through our election, right? We've been able to unify a lot of people to come together. But I think the main challenge is like, how do we enact it now that we're in office?
So as a new elected official, I'm going to ask you to give some advice to the preservation community we have today, in terms of what do you think the preservation community needs to do to create kind of a broader reach and have a larger impact? I think in some ways we've been fairly siloed on specific issues, but how do we kind of expand beyond that?
I think the most important thing is not just show up for your issue. We all love our issues, of course, but I think the only way you're going to build the coalition is by showing up to all these battles. And one group that does this really well is Barrio Alliance of Neighbors. When there was going to be an eviction of tenants at 85, 83 Barry, they showed up. they're not an anti-displacement group. They get involved a little bit with gentrification causes, but they knew it was important because it was also, who are we preserving the Bowery for? It's just not the landmarks in the building, but it's the people. It's what makes it what it is. And I think by just showing up to the hunger strikes that took place outside of HPD or the hunger strikes that took place outside of City Hall, it really built a connection that's really unbreakable. And people don't forget that. And I think by that effort of just showing up for an hour every day, they're really part of this greater movement downtown. And so, as many of you go back home, I think when you look at other fights in your community, just don't see it as their fight and our fight. It's actually a unified fight, right? Because I think at the end of the day, we all really have the same goal. We live in this beautiful city, and we want everyone to have an opportunity to live and enjoy this beautiful city.
Another topic we're going to be talking about a lot today is sites of cultural significance. And I know your district has a lot of them. Do you have ideas of how we can celebrate and protect these places, especially when it seems like the LPC lacks tools or the ability to preserve these sites effectively?
Yeah, two ways. I think the most important way is to find creative and non-creative ways of activating these spaces, right? I was having a discussion with my chief of staff about, for millionaires, mega millionaires, and billionaires, when they see preservation, they see it as a piece of artwork, right? And I feel like that's when we lose the battle, when people use preservation as a way to enrich themselves or to have it as a treasure. I think we have to make these spaces available and active for everyone. And we see it in certain areas of significance, especially buildings of significance in our district, right? Education Alliance, beautiful building, great example of how everyone can use that space, whether it's a daycare center, senior center, they have programming throughout the year. And so I think it's really finding partners and being able to open up these spaces, whether it's for social services or find creative ways to make affordable housing out of some of these beautiful buildings.
And building on that, do you have ideas on also how preservation can really support small businesses, especially historic and legacy small businesses, given that we lost so many of them during COVID, and we continue to lose those?
Yeah, I think it's all about zoning. If you can make a commercial retail location be 15,000 square feet, then that's no small business is ever going to rent out of there, right? I think when you look at, Little Italy in the special Little Italy district, right? What do you see there? A lot of boutiques, a lot of mom and pop shop sales. When you look at the East Village and the protective zoning that they were able to get through the East Village rezoning plan, it still has a sense of small businesses, right? The Rivington Guitar Shop. I can name a few others. But when you look at areas that don't have that protective zoning, that's when a developer could come in, demolish 2 buildings, build 1 building, and convert, a 7,000 square foot storefront into a 14, 15,000. And who is that for? That's not for the Fujianese, dollar store, right? That's going to be for the Dwayne Reed, or that's going to be for, the vitamin aid shop.
Can you talk a little bit about the tension we're seeing between maintaining existing affordable housing and the interest in building new affordable housing, demolishing historic buildings to do that, and how we can really get the message out that this existing affordable housing, by preserving these buildings, that's really something that we want to focus on.
Yeah. Whenever this conversation brings up, I always ask the person who's giving me that question, when was the last time you saw a landmark be destroyed for 100% affordable housing? Right? Sometimes this is a false narrative. I think developers use this. Developers and people who support development use this as a way to defeat 2 enemies at once, right? To defeat the preservationists from trying to protect something they care about, and to calm down housing activists and say, no, this is the only way we're going to build affordable housing. And we've seen this narrative really take form and become really strong the past 6 or 7 months. And I think it's the biggest threat to both anti-displacement groups, affordable housing groups, and preservationists. And so I think we have to tackle the question at the root of it and say, are they really against each other? Or is this a false narrative? And I think that's what we have to bring up, because there are, I'm not going to go into all the tax credits that you can get for preservation and affordable housing, but it's doable. But typically the conversation never gets to that point because we're already losing the narrative.
And my final question, and then if we have a moment, if people have questions for the council member and he's willing to take a few, that would be wonderful. The other piece of the conference we were really interested in is equity within the preservation community, both the work that we're doing and the types of buildings that we're preserving and how we're preserving them. As you all may know, in 2021, the Landmarks Commission released an equity framework for the agency to ensure diversity, inclusion, and designations, as well as in its regulatory and internal processes. But so far, it seemed pretty slow going. How can we make sure the preservation community, if the Landmarks Commission has their own equity framework, how do we make sure that we're pushing as a larger movement to become more equitable both in what we preserve and how we preserve it?
Yeah, and I think it's key to figure out who you're preserving for, right? Even through this equity lens, someone showed me a map of areas that haven't been preserved or haven't had a landmark, and all of Lower East Side still doesn't have an historic district, right? This is one of the few diverse communities left in all of Lower Manhattan, but that's not where they're targeting. And when you talk to the LPC, it's not even, or the people are talking to say it doesn't seem like it's in their priority. And so when you look at equity, and when hopefully the LPC continues to look at it, they look at these communities, right? Because we have, if things continue as they are going, we have such short time to preserve the authenticity of a lot of these communities, right? Chinatown is under threat. The Lower East Side is under threat. Two bridges, in a year could be completely under threat. And unless we see agencies like LPC and city planning really truly look through the lens of equity, then it's not gonna work.
Great, well, thank you so much for your opening this day and addressing a lot of the things we're going to dig into deeper. We really appreciate it and look forward to continue working with you.
No, thank you. And I'm really excited to work with everyone here. I think this is a really great opportunity to set the tone of the next administration. And I think what we can do in Lower Manhattan is be the model for the rest of the city. We've been able to do so much work together. We have been able to kind of eliminate false narrative of what should be preserved and what shouldn't be preserved. And we've been able to call out developers who try to pit us against each other, whether it's in the Seaport with the museum, trying to save a museum or trying to save a historic district. We've been able to work really smartly, efficiently, and hard at really trying to change the conversation. And so I feel like the next 4 and hopefully 8 years of my term, we can really change the dialogue, the fight, and the future of the city. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Does anybody have a question for the council member? Yes, I don't know, are the mics on? Yes, if you want to step up to the mic and ask, just so everybody can hear your question.
Lynn.
Lynn.
Sorry, I was live about my This is Christopher Marte. So my observation about the Landmarks Preservation Commission is that it's too dependent on mayoral control.
Yeah.
So if he tells the chair, like, stand down on preservation, they're gonna stand down. So one of the reform ideas that's floating out there is to modify the charter to change how the commission gets appointed. Would you support that in the council and lead on that of, like the city council appoints 3 people, the borough president, they mix up power like that. Thanks, Chris.
I think it's extremely important to not have mayoral control over our commissions and agencies. And so I will fully support that. And, in the first few months, we've shown how just activism has been successful when it comes to LPC. In the initial budget, in the preliminary budget of the mayor, he wanted to cut LPC funding. And everyone saw that as a threat to landmarking and the historic significance of our city. Even though we don't all agree with the LPC, we all agree that there should be one. And because we were able to talk to the administration and really demand to continue to fund them as they were previous years, he was able to compromise and he gave them the funding that's needed. And so that gives me hope that if we push back and if we organize, we can be successful. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Marco Tamayo. I'm an architect, urban planner, and I'm a member of the community board for more than 14 years. So the issues I know very well. And one of the comments that I hear from you is massive developer enemies. I think it's completely unfair and wrong. Why? Because the city was created for the developers, not for the people, not the city. The city never could build anything. So my point of view is rather to see as an enemy is to see an opportunity to bring the direction that you want to do. For instance, let me explain you about affordable housing. Affordable housing, if you understand the meaning of affordable housing is from the point of economics, supply and demand. It's similar like you buy tomatoes. I'm sorry that put this metaphor. When there is a dry, the tomatoes are going high. When there is something in the process, the tomatoes is going very high. When the tomatoes produce very well, the tomatoes is very cheap. Exactly what happened in housing. Exactly the same. When you don't produce affordable housing, now the affordable housing is no more than affordable housing. When you pass legislation that going against to create affordable, to create incentives, that is going to go the house higher. And the higher it is, the less money is for families to spend for food or other services. So probably many of these low-income families, they don't have even food because they had to pay the rent. Mm-hmm. And you have to stop in that direction. But I think rather to say the developers are the enemies, I should say the decision makers are the enemies, because those are the people that make the final decision. Those are the people that make an agreement with the developers and make the direction in the wrong direction. And I think it's completely wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective. I completely agree with you that the city has colluded with developers to allow them to develop what they want. We see it all the time. We saw it in the former administration, right? Where you can do a FOIA and see the conversations that we're having between the developer and the council member or the mayor's team, even before the community knew about a development. And so I agree with you 100% that the city works in partnership with developers to gentrify communities. What I disagree with you to a certain extent is the supply and demand, right? We've seen a lot of housing being developed throughout the city, but who's it for? You know, I think that's the false narrative that a lot of people on Twitter like to make, you know, saying we need to build more to have more affordable housing. What we really need to do is build true affordable housing and not and not just housing, you know. And I think we see towers along the waterfront where they're completely empty, while we see our homeless population continuously increase. And the developer had an opportunity to probably not make all the profits that they would have made from that glass shiny building if they would have given it 50% affordable at different levels, right? But they chose not to. And so I believe in the partnership and the collusion between the city and the developers, but it's also the developers thinking profit over people. And so I don't believe in the, you know, this trickle down system of saying we need a lot of housing because eventually it's going to build affordable housing, or it's going to, you know, the market's going to take shape and actually bring down rent prices, because we've been developing a lot and that's not what we've seen.
Anyone? I'd rather let someone else ask a question.
It's a statement also, because I just want to thank you for your story. because I feel like you've been in the trenches and you've experienced it in a real way. And I think the problem with, when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about units. We're not talking about affordable communities. So what I think happens a lot is you get these 20 or 40 or 100 units, but you destroy the whole community of affordable housing. And I think we have to think that way a little bit. And to your point, I'm just going to mention like the 421A tax credit, which was for affordable housing, which is now being used for luxury housing, 30-year tax abatements. It raises everybody's real estate tax, but not the people living in, yet they hardly contribute to the city. So I have an issue a little bit with that. And I want to bring up 2 points that maybe to think about in terms of advocacy. Like how we used to think about using the idea of the green materials. Like why are we using, instead of talking about the LED new materials, why aren't we looking at the existing materials and how green they are, that we have these green buildings already in our built environment? And the other thing is, when it comes to like tourism or filming, most of the things are not being done in new construction. They're looking at the historic authenticity of the city. They're looking for the old bars, the old neighborhoods, that kind of thing. I think we have to use it to our advantage, to try to use that to advocate in those 2 ways as well, to use it to our advantage and to put the narrative towards preservation, not the opposite.
Allison?
Thank you, council member. So we talk in preservation and the HDC about how we have to be more proactive when it comes to dealing with rezonings and bad development. But how can we actually be more proactive when developers have their links to city planning? They set the stage for the zoning behind the scenes with AKRF or other third parties. What can we do, or maybe to Lynn Ellsworth's point, is this a matter of other charter changes? What can we do with, how can we be more proactive given that?
Of course, we need the charter change. That's a long-term, battle. But, I think being civically involved, supporting candidates that are going to support your mission. We're going to have a lot of congressional races, and even though they have less of an influence on zoning, it makes a huge statement if people come together and support a candidate that supports their values. Luckily for us, we have overlapping elected officials that have been able to sign on to our letters, no matter how radical they are, because people elected them. I can call up Senator Brad Hoylman and he'll sign on to something because he believes in it as well. And because the people that got him elected, a lot of preservationists in the West Village believe in him. And I think once you have a coalition of elected officials to push an agenda, it makes it so much easier. And, that's where we haven't won enough battles. This past city council cycle, Rebney took on 6 candidates, and I was one of them. And only 2 of us were able to get elected, myself and Alexa Aviles. So in that battle of whether real estate is going to have a huge influence in our city government, we lost on a citywide level. And so, I would say be engaged locally, support candidates that have your values, and that will do the work, because it makes a huge difference, especially on a letter, whether it's just one council member writing a letter because he's mad, or if it's a letter from a congressional person, from a state senator, assembly person, and your council member, all in a unified voice saying, we need this change.
Now, one final question.
Michael Kramer, Seaport Coalition. Lynn asked my question about landmarks. I want to focus on the ULIP process and how the land use lawyers have learned to game the ULIP process, so that it's really just a charade. Can the city council do anything?
Yeah, we can. The city council members know about applications weeks, months, sometimes years before the ULIP clock starts. And one thing we've been able to do, and this is a really small example, but we had a developer in the Special Italy district that wanted to do an 8-story building that would have, broken that protective zoning. And because we knew about it in advance, we reached out to the developer and said, don't move forward. We're not going to approve this. And you know, it was a huge win. It wasn't widely publicized, but it just shows you that like if you have a council member that really wants to change how ULURPs are done, you can definitely change it even before it starts. And you know, we saw a rush of ULURPs in the last administration in this district, probably because of that reason, because I won't even entertain them if I don't find any value in them.
Well, on that note, we want to thank the council member again for taking the time today to start off our conference and talk about a lot of the issues we're going to be digging into further. So thank you again so much. We are going to move right into our next presentation, a very special presentation from Rachel Robinson from the Providence Preservation Society. And after that, we will have a 15-minute break before our first panel starts. So with that, I'd like to invite Rachel to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It is weird but wonderful to be back in person. And so we'll see if I can remember how to do this from a lectern instead of my home office. Good morning to you all. As has been said, I'm Rachel Robinson, the Director of Preservation at the Providence Preservation Society. We certainly appreciate Allison and Frampton and the rest of HDC for this invitation to be with you this morning. Who in the room has been to Providence, Rhode Island before? Good. Well, I can attest it's a comfortable 3.5-hour train journey from our SOM train station now to Moynihan Train Hall. So I hope you'll come up and visit us. I'll inspire you to take a look at some of our buildings. We refer to ourselves as PPS, so I'll be saying PPS rather than Providence Preservation Society. We were founded in 1956, so not as early as some of the initial grassroots efforts in the 1930s in Charleston and New Orleans. But in the 1950s, Providence really was a hotbed of preservation activity with institutional spread on College Hill, which has 2 colleges, RISD and Brown University, and with federal programs such as urban renewal and buildings of interstates. We thank our founders, the ABCD founders, that's Betty Allen, John Nicholas Brown of the Brown family, Happy Chase, and Antoinette Downing. And just a word about Antoinette, if that's not a name you're familiar with. She's roughly a contemporary of Jane Jacobs. And while they were very different people and had different backgrounds and different MOs, you know, they continue to inspire us, and they put so many things in motion that we're still working with in the preservation movement. This included the College Hill study of 1959. So this was an effort. They raised money locally. They worked with what would become HUD and our new city plan commission in Providence to do this really thorough and groundbreaking study of urban renewal, but also how preservation could be a part of that, how you can weave in the historic fabric of our small but very densely historic city into urban renewal. And in reading it today, you know, it's not a perfect document from our lens, but it really makes for an interesting read. We've got a scan of it on our website, so I invite you to look at that if you would like. And then by 1960, they had set up the Historic District Commission. So that's our version of PLC, and the first historic district, local, is the College Hill District, which is the east side of Providence, on the east side of the Providence River, and still our largest local historic district. So our offices are on College Hill. We own 2 buildings, 2 18th century buildings. The 1772 Shakespeare's Head, which was originally a residence and a print shop, and then our old brick schoolhouse of 1769, which I have a picture of in a moment. We always begin our programs with the acknowledgement that our office and our buildings are located on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people and nations. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call those lands home today. All right, so since many of you have been to Providence, our types of buildings might look familiar to you. Center right, we have a building in the Jewelry District, just south of downtown, and center left, our triple deckers. I'll leave it to you to figure out why they're called triple deckers. Providence was founded in 1636 by that nut for religious freedom, Roger Williams, once he was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We are miles away from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States of America. And that was at Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in the 1790s. So this began with automated cotton production, our American Industrial Revolution. That continued in Providence with Fruit of the Loom, for example, and then also incorporated jewelry manufacturing and silver production, including the Gorham building, the Gorham Manufacturing Company. They had a building at 390 Fifth Avenue that survives and was a McKinley and White building. So here, this is the type of building stock we're working with. Our manufacturing has largely dissipated, although it does still exist in small pockets. And there's a great housing need, as there is anywhere. And it was interesting to hear the council person speak about the trickle-down effect, because we certainly do not see evidence of that happening in Providence. I am often surprised, and anecdotally, I was surprised by two close friends of mine in Providence who told me that their buildings weren't historic. And they both live on the east side. They both have 1930s buildings. One is a lovely Tudor revival in a former streetcar suburb. The other is an important early Bauhaus-inspired New England brick residence. And I thought, why? You're telling me, your friend, a preservationist, that your building isn't historic. Why is that? And I think there's this overwhelming misperception, particularly in Providence, that a building has to be colonial or Victorian to be considered historic. That's simply not true. We do have a lot of colonial buildings and Victorian buildings that survive, but just by doing the math, 1970 was 50 years ago. So if we're only using the 50-year rule as a first tool, then you can see that most of our building stock could be considered eligible for historical, architectural, or cultural significance, just with that measure of 50 years. All right, so that's a little bit to get us into why I was asked to speak, which is about our strategic plan. And in so many ways, this is just the beginning of our story. So I'm pleased to share with you, to be here to kind of whet your appetites for how we've begun the process and have found ourselves fully committed to what we've laid out in print. Since 1956, PPS has played an important role in the preservation and revitalization of the city. We have innovated the practice of historic preservation, establishing a reputation as a national thought leader in our field. Upon our founding, we piloted a model for urban renewal that included historic preservation as a core tenet, a revolutionary concept at the time. And this is the College Hill study. Later in 1980, we launched the Providence Revolving Fund to help revitalize neighborhoods using real estate finance tools. And it became one of the most admired revolving funds in the country. It spun off to be a separate organization, but continues to do great work. Today, however, we and our preservation colleagues nationwide struggle to demonstrate relevance to a broader audience. So our challenge is facing preservation in the 21st century. We now have a long, 60+ history year and track record, but what do we do in the year 2020? While transformative of the built environment, our work has not engaged a citywide audience, nor adequately protected and stewarded Providence's complete architectural legacy. We have not kept pace with the issues most affecting the residents of Providence. Recognizing this and believing that historic preservation has a role to play in addressing a range of contemporary challenges, we set about to develop a strategic vision that will engage the broader community of people who care about preservation, who care about thoughtful planning and design, vibrant and healthy and safe neighborhoods, and affordable quality housing. We hope they will join us in realizing our vision of a vibrant and sustainable city of Providence where everyone can thrive. PPS believes this plan embodies our founders' hopes for Providence and is forward-looking in a way that those thinkers and innovators, as well as subsequent leadership through the decades, would champion. We hope you agree. So, the plan, the strategic plan. And I must admit that normally or previously serving on staff or boards, I'm the kind of person who would roll my eyes when you mention strategic plan. I would just think, great, let's go through this little exercise. We all know this is going to end up in a binder in the bottom of a file cabinet. But I think just the mix of things going on nationally and the different type of time we've been in the last 2 years, working from home, working remotely, there was just some sort of magic in the air, and we committed ourselves to this work and this internal scrutiny, and really are believe in the product and the outcome. We began our strategic planning process in the fall of 2020, and were deeply moved by then current events, which we felt permanently changed cultural perspectives in society. The global pandemic and the summer of racial reckoning underscored our nation's legacy of systematic racism and injustice. It inspired PPS to consider our own culpability in this legacy and to commit to addressing it in a real and meaningful way. The planning process included a number of activities and internal assessments. It began with an anti-racism training workshop conducted by Rhode Island for Community and Justice. This was followed by an audit of latent racism in several of the organization's projects and programs, a community survey, a series of in-depth interviews with external stakeholders, and those were both our sister organizations with whom we work very closely and organizations and individuals who don't even know who PPS is. And finally, an internal review of the organization's assets and capabilities. And we went through and were able to figure out our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So here is a snapshot. One of the great lessons we learned is that we love buildings. I unapologetically love buildings. I see the world in buildings. We need people in pictures of our buildings. And so that was step number one. Our current board chair happens to be, lucky for us, an architectural photographer. But he set about the goal of finding people of Providence in front of the buildings of Providence. So you'll see there our vision, which is new, to celebrate and preserve Providence's past, building an equitable, vibrant, and sustainable future. And then in the bottom right, we have really an amended version of our existing mission statement. Sometimes just changing a few words and making it a little more intentional, pumps it up. And so we would not be a very good preservation society if we did not support and advocate for historic preservation. We continue to do that. But we also consider thoughtful design and people-centered planning. And something you all may deal with here is that sometimes folks wonder why a preservation society concerns itself with planning and zoning and infill and new construction. And the truth is we want what is built today to be complementary to the built environment that we've all inherited. And I personally don't want our successors in 50 years to wonder, what were they thinking, or what was PPS asleep at the wheel? How did this happen? So it's very important to us what comes onto the landscape today. We have 5 guiding principles to really help us at the big level to focus our energies and intentions. So you can read those here. We laugh at the staff. We don't know why putting people first wasn't first, but these are very important guiding principles that we've fully adopted. Here's a picture of one of our great, huge Queen Anne / colonial revival buildings of the late 19th and early 20th century that Providence has so many of. And our 5 focus areas. So these help us more day to day at the staff level to figure out is what we're doing part of speaking to the strategic plan, an existing program or something that we would like to endeavor as a new program. So this just helps us prioritize. One of our programs that we started prior to the strategic plan process was a windows and workforce training project. Old buildings have lots of windows. A lot of windows can be repaired instead of replaced. And so, and there are people in our community who have barriers to employment, who are underemployed, who are unemployed. And so it makes natural sense. We're not the first to try to bridge this gap of needing the tradespeople and training those in our community who need work. The others, touch on both that gray area between the advocacy work I do and the education work that my counterpart, the director of education, does. I'll also point out number 4, building a community of rehabbers. We realize that not everyone considers themselves a preservationist, and we want the circle to be much wider. And there are those, unlike myself, because of student debt going into this field, do not own property. So, but property owners, homeowners, understand buildings in ways that we, scholars and practitioners do not. And so we want them to recognize themselves as preservationists. We're also working intently on daylighting the Black history and heritage of College Hill. College Hill is the most documented part and oldest part of post-English settlement Providence, but that's through one very thin lens and does not include those of descendants of the African diaspora. And so we're trying to see what our role in and responsibility is in daylighting that history. So finally, just some images to wrap up here. This is the back of our building. On the left, the old brick schoolhouse, where our headquarters have been for many, many decades now. We embarked upon a capital campaign prior to the strategic plan, prior to the pandemic, to accomplish 2 major goals. That was to reinstitute the director of education position, and we're so fortunate to have Kelsey Mullen in that role. And the other was to make some improvement to our building. Minor cosmetic on the inside, just to make it a more comfortable 21st century office building. And then hopefully adding this discreet and attractive addition on the back so that we have an elevator access to our 2nd floor. Our 1st floor is largely the old school rooms, largely open office plan. And the 2nd floor is a great big room where we want to invite the community in so we can educate them, so that we can share the space that we're fortunate to have. And I will just note, not the building behind it, which is a RISD building, but the building across the street is the old State House where our SHPO is located. So they have signed off. They will be looking at this addition. So we think everyone's happy with it. On the images on the right, we have at the top, again, we've just really embraced windows because they are the issue for us when it comes to preservation at so many levels. This is a rehabbers workshop for property owners. And at the bottom, I think that's our 2nd cohort of the window and workforce training program. What you can't see is the tip top of our lightning splitter houses, which are native to Rhode Island. But one word, windows. If you want to get people excited and engaged, some of our homeowners and students have just gone, we've started an addiction. They love knowing how, having the skill and being able to use it, and there will be no shortage of work for them. So that's all I have. I do invite you to, we've got a lot of information on our website, both historical and up to date. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Please come visit us, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Hi, thank you very much. Does PPS have programs in addition to the windows that you would encourage people to become preservationists?
Right. So between, it's kind of the amateur property owners, and we are cognizant that not everyone owns a house. Most of the staff, including myself, does not own a house. So we do try to include renters in our thinking and planning. So there's that level that's more casual one-off events. And then there's this training program. We've started with windows just to make it manageable. Fortunately, our congressional delegation is 4 people, 2 senators and 2 congressmen. They all, believe in preservation. And we just got a Senate grant to really help us continue this work. It takes money. That's really all it takes. We now have the foundation to do the program. We've had a coordinator, to create this program and now maintain it. It just takes money. But labor is a good way to get money and to help the preservation effort. Yeah.
Window restorer to kind of notes and make wood. $85,000. So everybody in my building is hostile to preservation.
Yep.
Not enough places to get lower the price. So
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and it's a great way to collaborate with other groups. We've been, for the window and workshop training, we've collaborated with Dorcas International. We can't do it all on our own. Our skill set is architectural history and historic preservation. And so it's a great way to get some government funding and to collaborate with other organizations in the city.
Yeah. So my question is, I noticed the triple deckers,
Mhm.
and my impression is that this was
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is there a resistance to dialogue with developers?
Right. I mean, it certainly is established in Southern New England that it's basically 3 flats. I live in one, it just doesn't have decks on the front, but it's basically a 2.5-story building with 3 flats. And so many of them were used by multi-generational families, not just individual, 3 young professionals today, but it's a lot of community and housing under one roof. And we have that track record that it works, and there's more of a need now and an acceptance for multi-generational family units. I think it's just a matter of where there's room to build and what the zoning now allows. But there are some examples, and then you get in, egress issues. It's hard to do that 3 flats rather than 2 doors. Yeah, so I mean, it certainly can be done, and I think pursued. I just can't think of any examples of brand new triple deckers, but we have so many of them that can be restored and continue to be used. Are we okay? Okay on time? Okay, I saw your hand.
Usually define what a very because wealthy people always will take advantage of the law because they know very well who people or people they come to while the majority preserve, the few ones always will get away with whatever they want. We have this
the Providence 1 and 2, how does the issue of window treatment, which is good, because when the window system doesn't provide the material to use, but have you ever thought to go deeper in that? But one of the control of the religion, increase the law and more expensive for the
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much for that. I'll address the windows first. And again, this is really just providing a skill. This is still in its infancy, but to show people, homeowners or someone looking for a new trade, that they can do this. We can repair old windows. We can take them out. We can fix them up. We can reweight them. They don't have to end up in the landfill. In terms of energy efficiency and those second and third tier issues, I'm sure we will get into that. This was just kind of a, we got it. This is so important to us. We want to get it off the ground and provide skills. And I wish I had checked the number, but I think at least 3 of our alumni have started their own small businesses and, have had client after client, because there's just such a need once people realize that you can repair windows rather than replace them. I think one of the biggest issues we have in terms of preservation in Providence is what I'm not a native New Englander or Rhode Islander, but a dismally low number of local historic districts. And so, I look at the city, throughout the city, and there's all this great architecture of, a wide variety, everything you can find in the Victorian period or in the 19th century, tons of stuff in the 20th century, which of course the majority of that is now considered or eligible to be considered historical. We just don't have the local historic districts. We've got pretty good National Register historic district coverage. And I'm actually doing a talk next week. I thought I told everyone in Rhode Island the difference between local historic districts and National Register districts. But we're doing another talk just showing, demonstrating and explaining the difference between largely honorary, getting into tax credits and that sort of thing, versus the local review and regulation of the exterior of buildings. And so with that, where we have local historic districts is largely the more affluent neighborhoods. And so there is money to invest in the buildings, and there's also that regulatory authority to make sure that the work is done properly. That's not to say that there aren't historic districts in lower income neighborhoods, but we just have very few. I worked in New Orleans many years ago, and a lot of the city is local historic districts. I think there are 14 or 16. All right, how are we on time? Okay, how about you, sir?
Sure. Only because you had mentioned that one of your co-founders was a contemporary of Jane Jacobs.
Yeah.
I was just curious as to why then this now in your mission statement, people-centered planning, what it sounds like that was actually probably an original vision.
Yeah, I thank you for catching that. Sometimes it's just a matter of putting things in print to hold ourselves accountable. That's what a lot of the strategic plan is, so that it's on our website. We had a board meeting this week, and one of our new trustees reminded us, this is great. This is really good work. We all feel good about it. We're all in on this, but now is really the hard part. We've got to do this work so people who aren't familiar with PPS believe that we believe this. We've got to do it. And so that's what we're working hard to do. There have been at least 3 groups, not one committee, and kind of 2 groups that I've been working with since January. So we printed this or announced it in November of last year. And so, that's adding to the workload. Of course, we have to prioritize what we're going to continue doing or change, and what we're going to add, because we're just very serious about making these new relationships, hopefully friendships and inroads and productive work. No, this is just the work as a result of the strategic plan, just being more strategic about who we're spending time with and what we're working on, trying to step back a little bit from review. I do attend all the public hearings related to the built environment, but trying to trust the HDC, which is our Historic District Commission, not you all. Trying to trust them for the local historic district protection that we do have in Providence, trust the commissioners and the staff to regulate and review that so that we can spend our time in neighborhoods. I failed to mention, so I'm glad I got to this. Providence has 25 neighborhoods. I reckon that we spend, and throughout our history, have spent about most of our time on 5 of those neighborhoods. So we have a lot of work to do. I am sorry to say that our staff is currently larger than HDC staff. We have not even 200,000 people. The state of Rhode Island, which is the smallest by size, but not population, is 1.1 million. So but every small organization has limitations just in capacity. Our resource is our human resource of the staff. And so we have to very carefully prioritize and curate our programs to get our biggest impact. I often say that advocacy work is not income generating. But I fully believe that the work we do and HDC does is important for the community. So we need everyone's support, including financial support. And on that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're going to take a short 10-minute break to prepare for our next panel. So if everybody can please be back with us at 10:40. Thank you. Welcome back. I am going to just say a few housekeeping things and then introduce our moderator, HDC Board Advisor Dinesh Kanirwala, to introduce the panel. We have 2 panelists who are remote today. We're flexible because of COVID. So we have 2 people on Zoom and 2 people in person. At the end of the presentations, when we do questions, the 2 people who are on Zoom will not be able to hear your questions unless you come up to the mic. So please do come up to the microphones if you have questions for the Zoom panelists, because they will not be able to participate in the conversation otherwise. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dinesh.
Hello, everyone. This is Danish. Welcome back. We are on the panel 1, Affordable Housing and Preservation Policies, Case Studies, and Lesson Learned here. Just going to read a little title here. As the affordable housing priorities of the new mayoral administration are still in development, the time is right to explore how preservation can support affordable housing in New York and how land use policy impact what is preserved. So I'm very happy here to introduce 3 panelists here. Caroline, who is a professor at history, data preservation, historic preservation and economic development, focusing on the relationship between the urban heritage conservations, urban regenerations, and the poverty reduction. She'll be our first presenter. Will be followed by Laila Law, who is the chair of the Manhattan Community Board 5 Land Use, Housing, and Zoning Committee. And at the end, we'll have Rebecca, is currently a design program manager for real estate development at New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. Caroline will be presenting online.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm glad to sort of, see everybody there virtually at least. I'll go ahead and just dive in. the preservation and affordable housing, I'm going to be talking to you about one way that I think we can actually get preservation and affordable housing to work more in tandem rather than in opposition, which is generally the way that most people think of preservation and not just affordable housing, but economic development. So we will just go ahead and dive in. And I will start with this by saying that preservation, historic preservation has an image problem, right? It was evolved significantly from the days of elitism and representing monumentalist narratives of dead white men. But you really only need to scan preservation related headlines in the news to see that by and large, the preservation discipline is still very much accused of and seen, at least on a public level, as being elitist and in opposition to equity. Now we have both preservation supporters and its critics who are increasingly demanding greater and more comprehensive inclusion of minority and marginalized communities within the preservation process. And the thought is that, by including communities, we can ensure fair distribution of preservation's costs and benefits. And I and many others, I really do believe that, given the current climate of political and social dialogue, that it really is to our benefit right now to take advantage of this moment and, sort of seize the moment to kind of reshape the image of preservation and to show that it can be applicable to contemporary issues and really address ideas that preservation is incompatible with equity, because in reality, preservation can contribute preservation can contribute rather than detract from equity and justice when it's done with some thought. So the way that I have been framing this is an equity preservation agenda. And again, as you can see, it includes marginalized groups through participatory agency. And I'm just going to go ahead and read a definition that I've crafted of what I believe to be an equity preservation agenda. It's a process through which historically marginalized groups exercise greater participatory agency in identifying, elevating, and protecting the place-based histories of racial, ethnic, gender, income, and class-based groups. An equity preservation approach works towards distributive, perhaps reparative, parity with regard to both process and outcome. And in doing so, preservationists can enable outcomes that provide a counter narrative to the field's perceptions of elitism and exclusion, placing the discipline at the front of current conversations surrounding social justice and equity. So it's a lot of words there. I totally understand that. But, I think the key takeaways, again, are marginalized groups are put at the center through a participatory process that really puts agency or gives agency to these groups. And in doing so, has, a sort of redistributive process and outcome towards equality. But the big question, right? That's sort of a big pie in the sky idea is, again, but how, right? That's the question that everybody asks. Okay, this is all great and well and fine, but, but how? How do we actually do this? Excuse me. So there are many, many answers and many, many thoughts on how to get this done. So, I'm not going to say that we have all of the answers, but I think that there are a number of tools that within the preservation field, we have not yet even begun to explore or take advantage of for a number of reasons. They're uncomfortable for us. They make us, we don't really understand them. We view them as, being a part of somebody else's lane, right? But a big part of what I think we need to do in order to, move towards equity preservation agenda is cross over into some of those lanes and at least shake hands with the people in those other lanes to try to understand what tools they might have that we can apply to our own work, right? Because the world doesn't operate in silos, unfortunately. And so to the extent that we can try to break down those silos, it's to the benefit of everybody. So here I propose one tool of many that I believe to have great potential to respond to this question of how to actually increase equity and preservation. Again, through the lens of affordable housing, which are community land trusts. First, a quick, I don't need to sort of go over any of these facts to you who, in New York City about the affordable housing crisis in New York City. I did just see a statistic that New York is now the second least affordable housing market in the country, second to Miami. But again, so I also saw one statistic that said, with a projected median household income of $68,000 and a median asking price for buyers of $970,000, that would mean that a household would be spending 78% of their income on mortgage and taxes. So as we can see, it's not affordable for most people. Again, with the sort of census-based definition of extremely low income being any household that makes less than 30% of the area median income, we go even further to say that more than 25% of households in New York City are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And then that bumps up to almost double that, to 50% of households are rent burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So this is a severe problem in New York City, especially, but really across the country too, as well, obviously focused on, urban centers. And what we see in these urban centers is that, especially in the last couple of years with, the increases in property values, is that the gap between housing costs and wages, this sort of disparity and difference leads to homelessness and overcrowding on the streets. Overcrowding in many of these structures. So community land trusts, I'll just do a super quick overview of what CLTs are. I'm going to assume that most of you have at least a sort of rudimentary knowledge of what they are, but basically it separates the value between the property itself and the land. So what that means is that we have leaseholders or residents, community representatives, public representatives. The CLT is a third organization that actually owns the land itself, but the resident buys the house with restrictions on resale and use. There's generally the resident takes on a long-term lease, usually 99 years of land. And so by separating these two values, the resident or the purchaser or the renter, depending on who it is able to recoup the value of that. I don't know how to get rid of that. There we go. So this model allows for lower purchasing prices. It preserves long-term affordability in the neighborhood. And then usually the CLT model encompasses community-based counseling and education as well for community members and buyers or excuse me, renters. So again, community benefits or CLT benefits, it increases the affordable housing stock. It increases community wealth and improves community involvement, neighborhood stabilization as well, diversity and inclusivity. And then for individual households, you see higher percentages of renters becoming owners. And it's actually, most of the time, they're first-time home buyers who are entering into the CLT model. So it allows them a method to build wealth. So there are many avenues for both the community and individuals to benefit from the CLT model itself. And interestingly enough, the question when I first started understanding what CLTs were, the question that kept coming to mind was, okay, but CLTs, generally they're used in agricultural models or urban centers, but why can't they be used to involve historic housing stock as well, whether that's designated historic housing stock or undesignated historic housing stock, right? It's still one building that might be used for affordable housing, and it might be historic as well, right? So two birds, one stone. So one of the case studies that I was looking at, or that I am looking at, is Champlain Housing Trust in Vermont. It's the very first housing trust in the country. And it covers a very, very vast territory in Vermont, 3 counties right there. So, knowing that most of the Northeast has historic housing, again, designated and undesignated, the question that I went into with this was, well, exactly how is the housing trust viewing their activity? Do they view it as preservation of historic homes, or are they viewing it, are they focused more on the affordable housing side? What's the connection that they as an organization are making, and what can we take away from that? So in my conversations with the former executive director, she acknowledged, they're part of the community. History is a part of the buildings, but their primary goal is to create low-cost housing. That said, they are still involving and taking on historic preservation projects, right? Converting a former dungaree factory into 28 affordable homes in a historic area, right? And so when they do this, they are actually abiding by certain, preservation regulations for windows and for housing quality and construction modes as well. So they are doing historic preservation, but again, there's that public image disjuncture, right, where they don't necessarily want to say that they're doing preservation, even though they are. Again, largest CLT in the nation. They have almost 3,000 at this point affordable homes, 530 of which are focused on ownership. And 2/3 of their sellers go on to buy in the private market with really low rates of foreclosure compared to the private market, right? A number of their projects are actually focused on people coming out of homelessness, abusive relationships, or people who are in need of social services. So really in this model, at least, CLTs are serving as a way to provide both preservation of affordable housing and historic housing, historic structures. And in doing so, they're providing access to housing, to markets, and to spaces, really, that these households might have been barred from as barriers to entry before. So it's shifting the balance of preservation towards economic and social and physical equity in this realm. Now, I don't have time to, I don't have time to go into other examples, but there are other examples of CLTs that I have found that in which that balance is actually shifted, in which a CLT is really focused explicitly on historic preservation as their primary goal, and then affordable housing as well. But, I've sort of, at this point, I'm sort of taking the perspective of it doesn't necessarily matter what the organization is prioritizing. What does matter is that they are doing both. Right? They're abiding by the historicity of the structures and seeing the value in these historic buildings, while also prioritizing the provision of affordable housing and social equity. So again, this isn't a panacea, as I said earlier, but I do think for a model like CLTs and any other model that is trying to work towards an equity preservation agenda, it really, the success of these kinds of tools really depends on the market and the governance conditions, right? You have to have a government that is supportive of these types of tools, as well as a market that can support these tools. And there needs to be checks and balances, whether that's built into the model, like a CLT model, or a third party who can kind of say, hey, actually, this value is getting pushed to the wayside, and you might want to think about this, right? But I think key to any of this is that there has to be deliberate inclusion in the preservation process. It can't just be perfunctory, right? It has to be something that is at the outset decided that we are going to, not just give these groups a seat at the table, but empower them and give agency to these traditionally marginalized groups. It's a creation of opportunity to encourage equality where it's lacking and inclusion where it's lacking. And throughout this process, this thoughtful process, we can really, I think, facilitate an equity preservation agenda. So with that, I think I am close to my time, but I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Caroline. I think we'll take the question at the end. We'll move to Laila. Hi, Laila.
Hi, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is an honor to be with you. I have a presentation that can go up. I can also share my screen if it's more convenient. I think you should have the presentation on your end, but if easier, I can share my screen. Just let me. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. So my name is Leila Logisico. I am the chair of the Land Use, Housing and Zoning Committee of Manhattan Community Board 5, which covers most of Midtown. Actually core central Midtown, going from 14th Street to 59 and from Lexington to 8th Avenue. I think all of you are very familiar with this district. And I am very pleased to talk about the interaction between the 421A program, which is a tax break incentive that is under the purview of the state of New York, but applies only to the city, and how it actually impacts our housing stock as well as our preservation impetus. So the 421A is a tax incentive program, as I said, that basically has had a great consequence on promoting and stimulating overdevelopment. And because there's such a scarcity of land in our part of the city, in Manhattan in general, it has had the impact of actually promoting demolition rather than preservation. So it is an interesting effect of the 421A, and it has been used to frame a narrative by pro-development groups to actually say that, you know, this is the only way to actually solve our housing crisis. So what I'm going to offer is to actually take a look at the numbers to dispel some of these notions and debunk some of these assertions so that we can reframe the narrative. And we're going to realize that actually housing policies and a preservation, historic preservation effort can work in tandem. So what is the 421A program? So it is an as-of-right tax incentive program available to developers of rental and condo buildings that provide a tax abatement for 10 to 25 years in exchange for the construction of 20 to or 30% affordable housing. The program has known a variety of incarnations. It used to be that the program could be used for off-site development, meaning that a developer would put a market rate luxury condo, let's say, to pick one example, on 57th Street, also known as Billionaires Row, and would benefit from the program, and in exchange would build a rental building in the Bronx. And this rental building would be affordable. The problem that we have seen with this framework is that very often the tax break is much more generous than the affordable housing that is being produced. So as I said in my introduction, what it has done, especially in our part of the city in Manhattan that is already very densely built, is that, you know, it is a great tool of incentivizing construction. But given that there is very, very little available land in Manhattan, then it has basically created an incentive, a huge incentive, to actually demolish our existing stock of buildings. To give you a data point, in the past 10 years, Community Board 5 has seen the demolition of 10% of its built environment, which means that, you know, if we keep going at this pace, we're going to replace our entire stock of buildings in the course of buildings lifetime, which is considered to be 99 years. As you can see, you know, there is a perverse incentive to actually destabilize and demolish our built environment. So here is how this sort of perpetual loop works. So the developers make this assumption: housing is so expensive because it costs so much to build. We need a tax break to build more and make it more affordable. So the New York State responds, okay, here's the 421A. You won't have to pay property taxes on new development for decades. The landowner then says, well, if the developers are saving big with the 421A, I bet they'll pay more for the parcel that I've got. So the developer says, okay, I'll pay more upfront because I know I'll save on taxes for years to come. Let me just get a bigger loan.
Laila, sorry to interrupt. Can you just widescreen put your whole screen up so that
Oops, I'm actually in full screen mode. Can you see my screen?
Like present mode.
just put it in the present mode, probably that will give us the full screen.
Okay, is it better?
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so here is where we were. Okay, so basically the loop. The developer says housing is too expensive. We need a tax break. The state says, okay, here's the 421A. The landowner then decides that they want to capture some of the value of this tax break. So they basically make the assumption developers are going to save big with the 421A. They will pay more for this parcel I've got. The developer says, I'll pay more upfront because I know I'll save on taxes for years to come. Let me just get a bigger loan. So the lenders and investors says, sure, you can take on more debt for this project, but you're going to have to make some bigger payments. The developer says, okay, I'll set first rents high enough to cover all this debt service, and then I'll sell my condos at high price too. And then you go back. This is why housing is so expensive. This is, the cycle of funding basically cuts through the notion of housing. As you can see here, we're not really talking about housing. We're talking about an investment tool, speculative action around land and a product that is then portrayed as housing, but that really is, when we talk about the market is commanding, we need more supply because the market needs to regulate. We miss the fact that we're not talking about housing market here. We're talking about a speculative market that may have a housing as collateral, but it is not the main function of this market. So let's dig into a case study, Billionaires Row. 157, which, if you can see my cursor, is this building in the middle, was the first super toll along Central Park. It was built under the 421A program. The developer constructed affordable housing in the Bronx and in exchange received a massive tax break passed on to condo unit owners. So the amount of housing that was produced in exchange for this tax break was actually pretty modest. It was in the Bronx. That doesn't really need that kind of stimulus to build more housing. So it did not create affordable housing on site. But also the value of this housing that was built is absolutely not commensurate with the value of the tax break. So currently, as you know, the 421A has known a number of incarnations. This kind of development is no longer permissible. You have to build on site. But nonetheless, we still have many of these remnants because the tax breaks continues while the affordable housing is offsite. So to make way for 157 new condo uber luxury tower, what's interesting to note in how it impacts housing is that a lot of rental buildings were actually demolished. So instead of creating housing, the 421A actually destabilized an entire neighborhood. According to census data, the area saw a loss of inhabitants. So this is something that we really need to wrap our heads around. We have built some of the tallest and densest buildings in terms of built density. And we have seen a reduction in the number of people who live in this area. And the reduction is actually significant. I think it's a 3% reduction, which is significant in sheer numbers and also statistically significant. So home suite, unaffordable home. Another trait of the 421A is that if it's affordable housing that it's supposed to create, why is it so expensive? Developers in rental buildings can set the level of affordability in their rentals for the affordable portion of the building that typically today has 30% units that are set for affordable units. They can set this affordability level from 40% of the MAI to 160% of the MAI. And in some cases, it can actually go all the way up to 200% of the MAI. So there is an example in this chart that we can go through a couple of lines. For example, 1225 42nd Street in Borough Hall, the affordable rent for a 2-bedroom at 130 MAI, the tenants would pay $2,710. Okay, the median neighborhood asking rent for a 2-bedroom is $2,000. So basically, under the 421A, the units are actually more expensive than the median neighborhood asking rent. And this is a situation that we see over and over and over. In my little list that I compiled with the help of housing with StreetEasy and Housing Connect, the examples are actually not in Manhattan, but we have similar examples in Manhattan, including in rental buildings in Hudson Yards that basically offer units that are under the 421A, deemed affordable, but are similar in price to the median neighborhood asking rent. So as you can see, they are deemed affordable, but they are actually not affordable. Another case study to actually show how preservation stabilizes neighborhoods. Clinton, the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen. So the Clinton Special District, located, fronting mostly 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, has actually a large stock of older buildings. The Clinton Special District zoning has a number of provisions that actually encourage preservation. And this goal has been mostly attained. So this large stock of older buildings is actually a very good way to preserve housing. Those are what I call good citizen buildings. Mostly the land is unencumbered from a mortgage. Speculation may have been there when they were built, but it has run its course. And now what these buildings do is not enrich bankers and lenders. They basically just fulfill their job of providing housing to tenants who need it. So, they provide a robust source of market rate housing that remains affordable. And preserving this stock of buildings is actually a much better tool of housing affordability and stability. So this is where you see that preservation is actually housing's ally. Historic preservation and housing stabilization have shared outcomes and interests. And although the narrative today has been reframed to make us believe that we need to demolish and rebuild, that we need to increase the stock of buildings with new construction, you can see that actually it is very often done at the expense of existing units that are affordable, and that we would benefit much more from keeping and stabilizing this stock. And something also that is important to note is that these tools of preservation, whether for historic preservation or housing preservation, also provide great stability for small businesses.
Laila, we are reaching the time limit.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. I'm almost there. So how much does the 421A program cost? Basically 1.7 billion on tax exemptions, and over 30 years, 22.2 billion. What could we have done with that money? Going forward, partnership is really the key. We need policy changes to focus on a partnership between historic preservation and housing preservation to support our robust existing housing stock while making way for responsible new development. And that is my conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now I present Rebecca Fitzgerald.
Design program manager at the Housing Authority.
I think we can't hear.
Is that, okay. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with the State Historic Preservation Office to list NYCHA developments in the National Register and use the Historic Tax Credit Program to support our comprehensive rehab programs. One of my jobs is developing and implementing design standards, working with teams of architects and engineers. Presentation deck. So just thank you. So one of my jobs is developing and implementing design standards. I work with teams of architects and engineers to build out best practices for the substantial rehabs of a really architecturally diverse portfolio of buildings with critical need of not only major capital repairs, but also investment in new building systems, new spaces, new programming, ultimately with the goal of improving building performance and setting buildings up for many future generations. So historic preservation and the tax credit program have been increasingly important to our planning and execution of these projects. I'll go through a little bit of background on our buildings and our work, and then talk about a few specific examples. So this is just starting us out with a bit of context, just to get a sense of the scale of the NYCHA portfolio. NYCHA has somewhere in the order of 328 developments across all 5 boroughs, and each development can be a collection of buildings. So the individual building count is actually much higher. That portfolio can be broken down into purpose-built and rehabs. The rehabs were acquired by NYCHA, many in the 60s and 70s, and were gut renovated. And the first of the purpose-built developments was constructed, as many probably know, in 1936. Many of those have also been substantially rehabilitated over their lifetimes. This is another way to look at the portfolio. So the green and the gray are purpose-built or new construction by NYCHA, and the yellow and orange are rehabs. And at the top, they're organized by number of stories, at the bottom by building area. This is one graphic in a much larger ongoing study with a team of architects and engineers, the goal of which is to build out a parametric model that will allow us to generate more precise benchmarks for things like building performance, energy consumption, upfront and maintenance costs, and other factors, and then suites of typical rehab interventions to meet those benchmarks. It responds not only to physical parameters, but also to regulatory ones, like the potential for listing in the National Register. So zooming out a little bit to NYCHA history, and right now I'll caveat by saying that I'm looking at NYCHA history through the lens of its design programs. These 2 photos represent 2 of the major movements in the history of NYCHA's design programs. On the left is the dedication of Harlem River houses in 1937, which kicked off decades of production of new construction housing by NYCHA. The dominant type during this period was the superblock campus, like Harlem River. And it was during this time that NYCHA had its standard details program. There were at least 4 iterations between the 1940s and the early 1960s. And they standardized everything from signage to benches and wall assemblies. On the right is the groundbreaking of what we call now Davidson houses, which was designed by Paul Rudolph. And this was after, about the mid 1960s, there was a shift from standardization to one-off designs by architecture firms that didn't work primarily in affordable or public housing. So this period saw a proliferation of buildings with different massing, materiality, and typical assemblies. That conversation had been happening at NYCHA since the late 50s at least, but in 1967 was the year that the Urban Design Group was formed by Mayor Lindsay's office, which put into practice a lot of those conversations about how design programs might push for new models and aesthetics beyond, or in some cases alongside, standardization. So this is just a selection of buildings in the NYCHA portfolio. It's a representative cross-section, I'd say, just to get a sense of the breadth of architectural history that's captured by NYCHA buildings. And we'll talk about some of these developments in a bit more detail. But the other thing to note is that at the same time as the NYCHA Standard Details program was phased out, NYCHA was also acquiring a number of pre-war buildings across the city and gut renovating them, often from SROs to become multifamily housing. And the last moment in this very short history of NYCHA happened in 2017 and takes us up to today. So on the left in black are 38 developments, and then on the right, the 3 developments in blue. The ones in black are part of the 2017 NYCHA and SHPO Section 106 programmatic agreement, the goal of which was primarily to streamline environmental review for NYCHA capital work. As part of the agreement, those 38 developments were identified as either National Register listed or National Register eligible. Since then, in the last couple of years, recognizing the benefit of historic preservation and the tax credit program to buildings undergoing substantial rehabilitation, we've worked with consultants and with the State Historic Preservation Office to have an additional 3 developments, the ones in blue, evaluated and listed. And our goal is to formalize that collaboration going forward for projects that can benefit from the program. And to note about the more recently evaluated developments is that in some cases, they've been evaluated less on the merits of their architectural significance and more on what they represent for NYCHA's history and the history of public housing as culturally and historically significant. From an architectural perspective, the challenge of working on these kinds of projects is not only the complexity that comes along with historic preservation rehab, but also the incredibly complex regulatory environment that we work in. So this is not comprehensive, but on the left are some of the standards and drivers that we negotiate when designing and constructing rehab projects. And the collaboration that we've been working through with SHPO has been really essential to our ability to balance all of these drivers. I'll speak to some of the sustainability and the accessibility drivers in particular with 2 of our case studies. So we will take a very quick look at 2 developments that are just beginning construction on their rehabs, Harlem River Houses and Williamsburg Houses. They have gone through a lengthy design phase and in consultation with SHPO have negotiated between those multiple sets of drivers, goals, and stakeholders. And in some ways, these were relatively straightforward from the preservation perspective. They were both already landmarked. So the challenge was less in advocating for their significance or identifying character defining features and more in mediating between sustainability goals, local law compliance, accessibility standards, and a sensitive, well-designed preservation project. This is a little bit more about Harlem River Houses. So both Harlem River and Williamsburg were built by the Public Works Administration housing program. They were both designed as cities within cities, so large campuses with multiple scales of outdoor space. And a major focus of the rehab design by Curtis and Ginsburg has been restoring the landscape plan. though with contemporary needs and contemporary code and federal accessibility regulations in mind. So at the top, you can see a drawing of new guardrails around restored sunken play areas and new accessible ramps. And then for me, one of the especially exciting features of this rehab is the conversion to electric heat pumps for space heating and cooling. So this is a case where pushing for a major upgrade to building systems, the benefits of which are not only compliance with local laws, our ability to meet sustainability goals, improve resident comfort and health and safety, but all of that was also aligned to historic preservation goals. So in installing a new heating and cooling system with the HVAC equipment on the roof, all of the window ACs could be removed and the windows could be replaced with high performance windows that look quite similar to the ones that were originally installed. And I should note that the original windows had already been replaced in the 80s, so there was no restoration that was possible, unfortunately. Switching over quickly to Williamsburg houses, this is the original site plan. You can see some of the similarities to Harlem River. So we have a super block campus and the siding and massing frame large and smaller interior courts. But Williamsburg has a set of conditions that are incredibly challenging to resolve with respect to accessibility. So not only are there grade changes across the site, but you can see on the left that the first residential level is actually about 4 feet above grade. There are breezeways accessed by stairs that provide access to some ground floor units. There are no elevators, and you can see in the plan on the right that otherwise residential units are accessed from very narrow stair course. So unfortunately, I don't have any drawings I can share right now of the rehab design, but it's something that the architects are working with us and SHPO and FHEO in real time. I think when completed, it's going to be a good example of how regulations, design, and preservation can work together. So finally, I wanted to touch on a few projects on the horizon. This is Classen Point Gardens. It's already National Register eligible with a major redesign by Oscar Newman in the 1970s that, based on early conversations at least, I think will make the design of the rehab project really interesting, both from an architectural and a preservation perspective. On the left is the original facade. In the middle, an image from Newman's defensible space. And on the right, an image from after the buildings were reclad as part of Newman's renovation. So within Newman's overall idea about inscribing individual responsibility into spaces, he also developed a system at Classen Point Gardens for giving residents a choice about how their unit would be reclad. His firm set up cladding mock-ups around the campus, and residents were able to choose from multiple colors, which results in that banding across the buildings. And this is something that we're interested in responding to in the future rehab. So not only the architectural qualities of the redesign, but the history of the process of participatory design and community engagement. Taking another look at some of the changes from the original design. On the left is the 1940s site plan. You can see the buildings are townhouse units with individual entries, but otherwise surrounded by open shared space. And after Newman's redesign, the outdoor spaces were broken down and aligned with individual units. So I wanted to finish up with a few ongoing projects from our design research studio that will continue to intersect with our work with the New York SHPO. First, we're working with teams of architects to conduct pre-design and planning studies at multiple developments. They're helping identify major challenges as well as design opportunities, but also building out our documentation of the histories of these sites, some of which are not listed in the 2017 programmatic agreement and may not have a resource evaluation on file. They're doing archival research, but they're also recording oral histories in conversation with property management and residents, many of whom are second generation, not only at their developments, but in their units. And finally, we're starting to build out our standards and best practices for deep energy retrofit on historic sites. So this is just an early study, but on the left are a group of buildings, some of which have already been identified as National Register eligible, some of which have not. And below, a number of potential typical rehab details, all with the goal of improving thermal and moisture performance of the building envelope, meeting the same performance targets, but with a variety of options for cladding, either from the outside or the inside, depending on the potential for historic preservation. And I will end there and open it up to questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. That was an insightful presentation. So I have mainly to all our panelists, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I have two general questions, probably to all the panelists, but to start with, beside what you have presented, do you see other tools or legislation that could help align preservation and affordable housing goals? Anyone can. Caroline? Bella?
Yes. Yeah, I have a hard time hearing you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can. We
Yes.
can hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And-
I'll get a stab at this one. Yeah, I think that, you know, on the legislative front, there are lots of things that can be done. I think that, you know, promoting and incentivizing preservation is going to go a long way. And we need to do it with the idea that it is going to help supporting housing. Right now, there's such a big incentive to demolish buildings that it is very, very hard. If we shift this incentive, if we put you know, the positive incentives on preserving buildings, then this is where you're going to see a shift. Because currently, you know, we have, as you know, a very powerful real estate industry that is basically in the business of constructing. And, you know, I think we can't blame the developers for what they're doing. It's their job and they're pretty good at it. What we need is a better regulatory framework with the correct incentives. I believe that the production of market rate housing does not need to be subsidized. I mean, we've seen it all over Manhattan. You know, it is happening regardless of tax incentives. What we need to incentivize is actually the retention of existing stock of housing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would absolutely, you know, ditto all of that. You know, we absolutely need to incentivize the retention of housing before we, you know, demolish it, because, as you know, sort of the simplest law of physics, right? Once it's gone, and we can't get it back. I would say that, you know, I think the tools that we have right now, you know, as I said in my presentation, they tend to be very siloed, right? So we have tax abatement programs and we have other kinds of tax-based systems and incentives that are very focused on preserving a specific kind of housing. And they all have sort of, you know, pluses in one column, but minuses in another, right? And it's often to the detriment of historic preservation. You know, some of these conversations around tax abatements as a sort of stopgap for gentrification. You know, there's a lot of arguments that those aren't necessarily as effective as we would like them to be. And, you know, that goes for any number of incentive. And so I think, in addition to what Leila has said, you know, one of the things that I think we need to do is look at the toolkit that we have right now. What do we have, you know, that exists? And where can we, you know, marry incentives so that we can fulfill, you know, preservation as well as, or the retention of historic structures as well as affordable housing. And I think one of those is, you know, I think not enough attention has been paid to twinning historic preservation tax credits with low-income housing tax credits, in large part because it's complicated, right? It's developers are super smart, they know what they're doing, they're savvy, but they're also, you know, they're on a time crunch. And twinning tax credits like that takes time and it takes expertise, and not a lot of places actually have that expertise and the knowledge of the wherewithal that, one, you can actually twin these credits, or two, of how to actually do that. So in some ways, there is sort of an education need, I think, within the development community, that these kinds of incentives exist, or and it doesn't have to be low-income housing tax credits, right? It's new market tax credits as well. It's other kinds of incentives that can be used to fulfill this singular purpose of preserving affordable housing within historic housing stock.
Thank you. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say that I agree. I think coordination is really coordination amongst the tools that we have and the stakeholders that we have is, at least in my job, a primary concern. And I think a lot of progress can be made just by identifying and analyzing. I think the word twinning is really useful to think about. And then on the design side, because a lot of preserving affordable housing and historic preservation, the overlap between those two assumes that we're rehabbing buildings, investing in them so that they can last for many, many more generations, many future decades. So as an architect, that is a lot of what I think about is making the industry standard of rehabilitation more robust and finding ways to marry concerns about sustainability and resiliency with historic preservation, which I think are natural partners. But on the architecture and engineering side, we still have work to do to standardize the approaches that we use that formalize the shared goals between those multiple programs or ideas.
Thank you very much. I think I'll open to the audience, please.
Thank you so much. I think the panelists present many issues, many questions. Each of them will require probably one day of discussion, but I'm going to be very briefly with the first two. And I think in Florida, probably we discuss what it is on a horizontal city versus a dense city or vertical city. It's hard to apply most of the principles. The principles are very good. Very quick comment about that. The other comment is about, since I live on above the community number 5, so I know more or less the issue of that the Leila presented to us. I think she's absolutely right. The only thing I had to convey with her is the loss of scale, creating a shadow of the iconic buildings such as the Empire State, Chrysler, Citicorp. These needle buildings actually completely changed the landscape of the city of New York. No anymore. In the past, we can see it. Chrysler, Empire State, and Citicorp, because of these needle buildings. And the only thing I had to be in disagreement is, yes, those needle buildings are extremely for luxury people, and they are very big, and therefore is rather to have a high density, have lowest density. And so I think I'm run away from them. So now I think I'm going to go with you, because I think it's the most complex issue that I found it. Let me start asking the first question. How many people lives in NYCHA? I think I'm going to help you because I don't want to put in the hot seat. I think it's 160,000 people.
I think
so. Probably is the second largest city in the state. So it is a city within the city. And I think it's, with all respect, I think it's impossible to manage NYCHA. NYCHA is poorly managed, this part. I studied.
So can we stick to the question?
Yeah. Okay.
There are other people also wants to ask.
So finally, I study very well Isaac and Holmes Towers. I found that to redevelopment that site is a shame. Why? Because those sites are within the flooding zone, and having in the flooding zone to reveal anything is, I think, is senseless. And my question to you is, why you are planning to use the unused or poorly used the land use. In NYCHA, for instance, in those towns, in those places, I'm finished.
Please.
In those parts, for instance, I can easily save $300 and $400 million just using the lands properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, ma'am.
On the topic of 421A, there's been a lot of critics for many years, and now quite a few city council members are coming out and saying that they oppose 421A, but they want to do something else. They want to give a tax break to commercial property owners instead of a tax break to developers. And I'm just wondering, Lila, what you think of that, and also, are you proposing an alternative to 421A, or just get rid of it altogether, or what would you suggest to incentivize the preservation of existing housing?
Yes, sure. So the one thing that is important to remember is that the 421A program is a state program. It applies to the city, but it is dealt with by the state. So it's the state legislature and the governor who basically have final say. Not to say that the city council does not weigh in, but they don't have the decision power on that. So as you know, it is set to sunset in June. And I personally think it's a good thing. We need to let it, just let it sunset. First of all, it has happened in the past. In 2015, it did sunset, and we actually saw a great deal of development in real estate activity and construction activity. So, this fear that if it disappears, then it's going to, entirely stall an industry is incorrect. The second thing I would say, just to echo the great presentation that Caroline gave us, is that I think that community land trusts are really the way. We need to undercut the speculative nature of the land. If we're really serious about creating housing that remains housing, we need to undercut the speculative nature of the land. And the only way to do that is to basically acquire the land under some sort of a government program and develop the housing so that it remains housing. One very good example of that is the co-op complex known as Penn South in the West 20s along 8th and 9th Avenues, limited equity co-op, where basically you own the right to stay in the apartment and live in the apartment in perpetuity. It is your apartment, but you don't own the equity. And it was meant to be an experiment. It was widely successful and never repeated. How about we go and put a legal and land use framework to actually be able to replicate it? We don't need it to be 15 buildings and 5 city blocks. We can do it on a smaller scale. But I'm very inspired by Caroline's presentation. I think it was very insightful, and those are ideas that New York City and Manhattan need to really seriously consider. And on the tax breaks to commercial properties, I'm not sure that there are any really formal tax break incentive programs from the state. There are tax break incentive programs in land that is owned by the state, and that includes Hudson Yards, and that could include the area around Penn Station if the general project plan is approved. I am staunchly opposed to it. It is ridiculous, unnecessary, a distortion of market. It is anti-capitalistic, and I think that these tax breaks need to be prevented at all costs.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really... Maybe one last question.
Thank you. Some of the panelists talked about the need to preserve affordable housing and how historic preservation can help with that. I live on the Upper West Side, and on my street, a number of what were originally single-family homes had been converted into multiple units, and now in the last 10 years have been converted back into single-family homes. And that's caused a loss of some of those naturally occurring affordable units. So how can preservation kind of deal with some of the challenges around that we can regulate aesthetics and we can keep these buildings, but at least in New York, we can't regulate use. What are some tools to try to make sure that we continue to preserve units, not just buildings? Thank you.
Anyone?
I'm happy to try to touch on this one and then maybe pass it to my colleague of NYCHA. I think that there are some ways to actually regulate use. It cannot be under LPC rules, but HPD as well as the Department of City Planning can actually introduce tools in their toolbox so that we have more stability. New York tends to say, oh, the tools don't exist. The tools are not in the toolbox. Well, we have a city council. That's their job to, introduce laws and introduce bills, pass laws. I think that, we don't need a big revamp of the charter to actually decide to say that, some of these buildings of lower scale that are, multifamily buildings must remain such so that they accommodate, more of their purpose as housing, rather than being converted to single family homes. Once again, the legislative tools may not exist currently, but that's the nature of the beast. That's why we have active legislative bodies. That's what they do to actually adapt and regulate.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there's a lot more flexibility potentially than we imagine, and also the tools that we have available to us are robust. On my end, where my work intersects with historic preservation, we're regulated by HUD, obviously, and the use of NYCHA buildings, the unit mix, the unit count, those are gospel, and so that's built into all of the preservation work that we do. Either way, I'll say even if we don't have a kind of formalized way more broadly in the preservation community to regulate use in this way that you're describing, as we're starting to expand the way that we talk about historic preservation beyond just the aesthetics or the historic significance of the architecture, but also to social and cultural history, I think talking about use and talking about preserving usability as multifamily housing or affordable multifamily housing is a logical next step.
Thank you. I think that is good for this panel. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll move to the next panel after 10 minutes break. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started so we can get you out of here today promptly at 1 p.m. Again, I'm Frampton Tolbert, Executive Director of HDC, and I'm going to be filling in for our moderator for our last panel, who is unfortunately not able to be here. So this last panel is really focusing on sites of cultural significance. As I mentioned in my early remarks, while the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission has designated some sites for their cultural significance, much work needs to be done to research, promote, and preserve these places. And how can LPC both consider and designate cultural sites, but actually how can we look much further beyond that to understand which sites are significant, who's deciding which sites are significant, and how we're celebrating, recognizing, preserving them beyond just designation. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist, Elena Martinez, is co-artistic director of the Bronx Music Heritage Center and a folklorist at City Lore, who will be sharing her research on the in the South Bronx on cultural landmarks. She will be followed by Shannon Garrison of Philadelphia's Department of Planning and Development, and Jerome Hafford, adjunct assistant professor at Columbia and co-founder of Brant Hafford, will be our final presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Elena.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Diego and Frampton for inviting me here today. And as he said, my name is Elena Martinez. I do work in the Bronx mostly, which I'll get to because the presentation is about that. But I'm a folklorist. I've been a folklorist at City Lore for many years. And City Lore has a project called Place Matters, which for many years I did a lot of the work on. The project Place Matters is about looking, preserving and looking at community sites through the perspective of the community and how the community feels about places. So I'm coming to you today, not from the architecture and design world, from the preservation world. I don't know a lot about that. My background is more coming from getting stories from people. So in Place Matters, this project, when people from the community would nominate a place or site that they feel was important to their community, we would go out and interview people from the community and just collect their stories and build up these narratives about the sites through the stories and through the interviews from people. So that's where this project came from, Place Matters. And then I started doing a lot of work in the Bronx. And so all my Bronx work sort of grew out of this Place Matters project. And to start with, one of the first things, an early project, oops. Why am I missing? I'm sorry, problem there. Okay, so a project we did through Place Matters back in like 2001 was we wanted to nominate some sites to the National Register of Historic Places, but not looking at them from the idea of that they're building, qualities, but and their architectural features, but looking at them from the community, how their significance to the community. So there were 3 sites that we worked on. Bohemian Hall, you see there on the left. On the bottom, you see Kyler Church in Brooklyn, and these were chosen because of their relevance to the community. Bohemian Hall, an old beer hall for beer garden for the Czech community, but later a lot of other communities used it for different things. And Kyler Church was a very important site for the Mohawk community that made its home in Brooklyn in the mid 20th century. A lot of the Mohawks would work in the steel workers union. So they were 2 of the places that we had worked on, and the one that I worked on was you see it, was this building on the left, the Manhasset building in the Bronx. And we worked on that because inside that, as part of that building was Casa Amadeo, which you see on the other side. So Casa Amadeo is the longest continually run Latin music store in New York City. It's also the first site on the first Puerto Rican site on the mainland to be designated onto the National Register. And looking at the idea of cultural significance was really important for us. And why did the community like this? For us, not only has it this great thing, it's the longest continually run Latin music store since 1941 when it was established in that building. The idea of them, we're looking at buildings and sites, not just for their architectural features, but that they are repositories of stories, or they are that people in the community might look at them and they trigger stories, they trigger history, they help us learn about the history of the people who lived in that community. So this Casa Amadeo, this record store, tells you really, if you listen to the people who, the owner of it now, know the story of the woman who ran it before, follows the story of Puerto Rican migration to New York City, from East Harlem to the Bronx. The Puerto Rican women who worked in the garment industry, because the woman who founded the store worked in the garment industry and sold clothes actually in that store in 1941 when she opened it, as well as music. The current owner bought it in 1969 and kept it going to the fires when all the when all those apartments were no one was in them except a few squatters in the 1980s, he kept that building, he kept his store alive by getting water from the pump. You know, and just, you know, at night, making sure no one, you know, broke into the store, staying there. So this building holds a story of what the Puerto Rican community did. You know, the original owner coming up from East Harlem with a store there, moving into the Bronx in the 1940s, which a lot of other Puerto Ricans started doing after World War I. And then, you know, being an early women entrepreneur, you know, and so it just tells this larger story. If it's not just, you know, that it's a record store, you know, a little humble record store, right? That's part of this building. And also, of course, as a music store, the Bronx has a really strong Latin music, all kinds of music, but a strong Latin music history. And of all the different sites that were part of the Bronx, this incredible scene that were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that were part of the Bronx, all these theaters and nightclubs. Casa Madeo is really the only one that's still standing from that era as a record store and part of that music scene. So again, so it holds a lot of history for the community. It's still there. It was nominated to the National Register in 2000, well, State Register first and the National Register in 2003, along with Kyler Church and Bohemian Hall. So we were really happy to be able to get something on the National Register that did deal with cultural significance. Not really, that building in Manhasset has some interesting qualities, but really the reason it was on the National Register was because of the store. Just indoors, inside with the owner, Miguel Angel Amadeo, Mike Amadeo. Who's still there, who himself is a great composer, very important composer for the Puerto Rican community. He's written songs for Celia Cruz, El Gran Combo, Hector Lavoe. If you're interested in Latin music, all those names be familiar with you. I do, because of the work I did for Place Matters, I started doing some walking tours in East Harlem and the South Bronx about the musical and artistic legacy of those places. And so I come across a lot of these different sites while I'm doing the walking tours in Longwood, Hunts Point, those neighborhoods, Morrisania. And theaters are also a really important site or sites in the Bronx. There's tons of them, I'm sure, all through the city. There's tons of these old theaters that were built in the 20s and 30s in these construction booms. These are some of the sites that are still there. You know, in the Bronx, you know, we were affected by the fires. We've lost so many interesting places, sites because of the fires and other things. But you have some of these theaters that still remain there. This is the Star on sort of the corner of Longwood and Westchester. You can, an older photo, you can see it there, and like on the bottom, you can see what it looks like now. A lot of these theaters have become churches, actually. Weirdly enough, oddly enough, for whatever reason, a lot of the theaters have become churches. And again, like some of the other buildings we mentioned, these are catalysts for stories. They also tell the history of the different immigrant groups that move through these neighborhoods. You know, a lot of these theaters. This is the Boulevard Theater, now Planet Fitness on Southern Boulevard. But you can see the an ad for a movie that was there. Again, a lot of these theaters tell the history of the immigrants that lived in these communities and the people who lived in the communities. Some of them started out as a Jewish catering hall. Some of them started out as vaudeville theaters for the Irish community. Then the Puerto Rican community moves in, and they're not. They're not. It's not the Boulevard Theater anymore. It's Teatro Boulevard, because the Puerto Rican community is in there now, Spanish speaking, and they show Spanish speaking movies. Later on, they start showing concerts and the musicians who were the big musicians of the day, from Tito Puente, Mongo Santa Maria. So they sort of like are places that have all this history embedded inside them. This is the Spooner Theater. The one on the part on the left, which was the Spooner Theater. It's been through many things now, like a store, a duanery, different things. But it's one of those sites, at least it's still there. We can walk by it and look at it and remember it. For the musical, it has an incredible musical history. Johnny Pacheco did a lot there. Charlie Palmieri. So people in the neighborhood remember going to these places. So they're really important reminders of that legacy, that artistic and musical legacy of the Bronx. Because again, Bronx gets a bad reputation, but we are very proud of the Bronx, and we can, those of us who live in the Bronx are very proud and can look back at these sites that hold all those stories for us. This is one of the most famous ones, Teatro Puerto Rico. Again, that was the Forum Theater, but once Puerto Rican communities started coming into in the post-World War II into the area. It became Teatro Puerto Rico. One of the probably hottest spots. Everyone has stories. Every musician from that era has stories about playing there. It was the spot. What, a lot of people might know in the African-American community, they call the Chitlin circuit, what musicians and comedians would follow. This was the Cuchifrito circuit. And this was the hottest spot on the Cuchifrito circuit. If you were coming in and, Mexican movies, it was the height of the Mexican movie era, the golden age of Mexican cinema. So they had Mexican movies there. They'd have actors from Mexico and musicians from Mexico, all the ones from Puerto Rico. And then these were really, Christmas shows where new people who are just coming from the island, new migrants from Puerto Rico might be settling in this neighborhood, want to hear the sounds of their homeland. You could go and hear the music from Puerto Rico there. So these were very important spots for the community. And also the Bronx Opera House, which many of you might know that it's recently in the past few years become the Bronx Opera House Hotel. But actually in between with the Bronx Opera House, around 1913, whenever that opened up, it was a major Latin music venue as well, the Caravana Club, major venue, the Caravana Club, and later called the Bronx Casino, before it became a church. And then it stopped for a while, and they've taken it over and it's become the Bronx Opera House Hotel. So so again, you just see the the neighborhood changing, and they might be telling the news story now, the Bronx too, the center of gentrification. And what tells you more about gentrification than maybe a boutique hotel moving right into your neighborhood. So so again, these sites again show the progression of who's lived there, what's been going on there. This building here is an interesting building. I was, it's one of those sort of like gridiron looking buildings. I was walking with someone from the Garifuna community by there, and he just stopped and told me, he goes, this is, we call that building the Wapuro building. Wapuro in Garifuna means ship, because that building looks like a ship. And many in the community felt it looked like a ship. And when I said, well, why did you call it that? Obviously not just from looks, but many Garifuna, you're familiar with the Garifuna community from Honduras, Belize, Nicaragua, who settled in New York City. A lot of them were merchant marines. So ships and that, a lot of that plays a big part in the settlement of the Garifuna community here in the middle part of the 20th century. So they, Wapuro, it's still, people call it that. The park next to it, Rainy Park, is called Wapuro Park. That's where people know to meet. And this became a really hot spot also after the, a lot of the Garifuna community was located over in Crotona Park, more like that neighborhood. But and that's where the Happy Land fire happened in 1993. And that really devastated, because, like 2/3 of the Happy Land fire were members of the Garifuna, Honduran and Garifuna community. And so that really tore the community apart. So a lot of them moved from that area by Crotona Park and came over more to this neighborhood by Prospect Avenue. So it holds a special part of that history for that community. Just want to point out Maxine Sullivan's home, actually the Bronx. We think of jazz history, Harlem, 52nd Street, St. Albans in Queens. There's actually by Boston Road a big jazz history in the Bronx as well. And again, a lot of the big great clubs aren't there anymore. But Maxine Sullivan was this vocalist who came and settled in the Bronx to raise her family, and that's her home, and it is still there. So it's one of these interesting places that's actually still there. And I just want to end with casitas. So casitas are we're all over New York City in places where there's Puerto Rican communities. A lot of them are gone, but in the Bronx, there's still a concentration of a lot of casitas in the Melrose neighborhood. And actually the very first one, like one of the original casita that goes back to the mid-1970s was built by Chema Soto, Rincon Criollo, which was, as you see on the top, that was the original site on the top slide. But because they had, there was an issue there. These were like community gardens. They're squatted on, right? People just built their gardens or built these casitas. If you were a Puerto Rican gardener, you usually built a casita on your garden. And that area was contested, that lot was contested for affordable housing. So they had to move, but the community made sure they were able to move up a few blocks away on 157th and Brook, and they created the one on the bottom. So that casita is still there. It's the oldest, the casita. Chema Soto, who created that, went on to help build some of the other casitas in the neighborhood. And which, right now, actually, City Law is working on a project to get it on the National Register as a traditional. The traditional designation. I'm spacing on that right now, but so we're trying to do it, but it's very hard because the National Register has very architectural standards, and there has to be there's very specific things. You have to be 50 years. You have to have certain sorts of criteria, but those criteria don't really matter to the community. What matters is that this casita is the original one that community members built, because in the 1970s, when everything was falling apart, that was a lot with glass and, needles on it, but the community members got together and said, we're going to build something for our kids to have green space. And it's become actually not only also a center of traditional Puerto Rican music. If you are from the island of Puerto Rico and you like the music of bomba, the music of plena, this has become sort of like a cultural center where everyone comes to come to this casita to hear that music. There's always music going on there. And I just want to this is a Bon Plenazo. It's a very big festival that happens every other year at Ostos Community College to celebrate traditional Puerto Rican music. And the casita is so important to it that you can see it's part of the poster that was for one of the Bon Plenazos. So again, this holds relevance. It might not hold relevance in terms of architectural significance or what the standards are for criteria of that, but for the community, this is one of the most important spaces of Puerto Rican culture, keeping Puerto Rican culture alive in the Bronx right now. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I apologize. I think I'm going next, and I hope you can hear me because. Yes, we can. Okay, thanks. I'm Shannon Garrison. Apologies, I can't be with you today. I am zooming in from South Philadelphia, where I work as a preservation planner with the Philadelphia Historical Commission. I'm going to assume I can share my screen, maybe, to share my presentation.
Yes.
Okay. That option actually just went away for me. Hold on. I am sorry. Frampton, I'm sorry. I used to have a share screen option at the top of my Zoom, and it is no longer coming up.
All right, just hold on a second.
Yeah, apologies. It is still not there. Okay, I'm being told to log in or log out and log back in. Maybe it makes sense for the other panelists to present, and I will try and be back to you guys soon with the presentation.
Should Jerome go next? Is that preferable? Okay. So I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Jerome Heffer.
Okay, so do you have my slides? I'm just going to use this to follow my notes. That's the best thing. Yeah, that's. And so I click next here. This guy. Do I have to hit something here? Yes, thank you. Okay, great. All righty. We're multimodal today. Can everyone hear me? Okay. And was I introduced already?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm reintroducing Jerome Hayford.
So you kind of know who I am. I might be a little bit, my name's Jerome Hayford. I'm an architect, also a public artist and academic. So this talk, we have a short amount of time. So I sort of erred on the side of putting some more maybe general concepts out there, in particular about some sites in Harlem, but also a related site in the Hudson Valley. Instead of going into maybe a deep exhaustive dive into either of those sites. So it sort of puts some ideas on the table that may be slightly more esoteric, I don't know, but hopefully.
Jerome, sorry, I think if you can pull the mic down a little bit, I think people.
Oh, hello, is that better? Okay, is that better? Is this the one? Can you hear me better? No?
Try that again.
I can just yell. Okay, there we go. Aha. Okay, wonderful. So I'll just jump into it. This work is in a way I've been sort of speculating and thinking about how these sites, what they sort of provoke for architects and our discipline. And I think that we can have a conversation about that. So this is just a kind of overview collage slide of my practice, which I was mentioning is a kind of expanded practice. I have a professional studio doing built work, which also kind of feeds research and publications, and then feeds into stakeholder engagement and academic work, primarily at City College and Columbia. Which also then feeds into sort of on the ground activism and direct engagement with, in particular, descendant communities and youth attempting to sort of generate new design work for some sites that I'm going to talk about briefly. I got to get my notes here. So as an architect, urban designer, and educator, I'm primarily concerned with how historically marginalized subjectivities and spaces really reorient our discipline and the way we think about architecture in particular and urban design, and how in turn that begins to inform other modes and values for practice, which directly connect back to how we teach architecture, how we think through a kind of paradigm of architecture from maybe a sort of static object to perhaps a set of policies or more kind of active time-based thinking, which I think the previous speaker was sort of getting at, right? And furthermore, so to build on that statement, I'm interested in specific context. This is an image in the middle and right of Kingston, New York, and histories which are typically overlooked in my mainstream discipline for reasons typically related to maybe race, historical dispossession, or erasure of the archive of these sites, or simply a lack of representation of folks to speak to that within architecture or urban design. And to take that further, that sites such as this, we're seeing on the left then a cropped image of the Harlem African Burial Ground site juxtaposed with this Kingston site, that these sites and built environments, even if they have been mostly erased, that is in particular of, say, maybe African-American, indigenous, or marginalized history, that they might unlock a new kind of disciplinary imaginary. And that's one of kind of different aesthetics or ethics or ideas of how to repair that are fundamental to these sites, or of even ideas of sort of new ideas of property ownership, new kind of speculative notions of civic and cultural infrastructure. And this is a speculative student project on the screen, etc. These are just some images of my work that are kind of tracking. And in particular in Harlem, where I live and practice between Harlem and the Hudson Valley. This is an aerial view of one of the more critical geographies of my practice for the first 5 to 8 years of my work, which is Marcus Garvey Park. Many of you are probably familiar with this park. I've done a lot of, I've worked with Angel Ayon in this park around the Fire Watchtower, but also sort of initiated public art to build awareness around the various histories in this site. And this is one of those pieces. So in those early installations, working with community organizations, but also less formal groups in the park, historic groups like the Drum Circle. We were really creating space-taking proposals, but also kind of rehearsing a sort of latent archive of this space and thinking about that fire watchtower, but also of sort of histories, oral histories, spoken word, speeches that had been given near or around that site, that in this piece, which was titled Sejura, we sort of had playing 24/7 as a kind of soundtrack in the space to sort of conjure some of those figures who are really important to this sort of landscape. So this question that I've been asking myself, and maybe some of you are in this panel, is really how do we excavate these overlooked histories to engage landscapes and the built environment in service of liberatory practice? So how do we attribute agency to these descendant groups or communities attempting to do this work and make sure that new design proposals are sort of embedding different values into how we might reimagine these sites that are kind of new construction? And so for me, this begins with really this kind of audit of architecture of my discipline, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now. And that's basically this kind of sort of critical acknowledgement of grappling with history on specific sites that has to do with, in a way, that how the suppression of certain histories and sites really expose some kind of professional or disciplinary blind spots. That is, what is being left out and unconsidered when we're producing the built environment, or for example, recognizing historic traits of buildings or attempting to get them listed on historic registrars, et cetera. And really, how do we begin to acknowledge that these are living histories that are still with us and not kind of past tense? And I think the previous speaker was sort of getting at that. So these are just a selection of slides and articles that are looking at these two African burial ground sites that I'm going to briefly talk about. One is the Pine Street African Burial Ground in Kingston, New York. The other is the Harlem African Burial Ground in East Harlem, which some of you may be aware of. And so for me, this began kind of close to home, and how my work in Harlem led to a deeper research and inquiry into these sites of, in particular, African American, and indigenous erasure. The Harlem African Burial Ground, which is the map is shown here above, really became this project of research and also teaching with young people, and then outreach into the community conducted around this site. And what I learned about this sort of forgotten site, I live a few blocks away from this site, and thinking is that the proposed redevelopment and memorialization of this site, I was really provoked to lead a kind of design studio with young people, and for them to speculate on what does it mean to produce a living memorial, and also have other kind of more residential, civic, and cultural programs all together on the same site. How do we even do that in this context, right? And ultimately also produce research and scholarship around this question. And so this is an image of the artist Abigail DeVille, who was sort of preempting some of the kind of ambition to redevelop this site and also rezone this entire neighborhood. It's a major ongoing rezoning and development area in the city. East 125th Street is just a construction site for any of you who live up there. But really has been, as you go further east, this kind of forgotten, environmentally degraded territory, right? That locals have been sort of aware of, but even the kind of local memory around this site is somewhat fragmented. And so I quickly realized that trying to meaningfully engage this site requires us to kind of open up new ways of understanding history, because the archive is quite lacking in terms of really a kind of repository of formal information. And this is essential to kind of creatively and ethically generating new concepts and forms of architecture and urban design that will not duplicate the sort of harms that have resulted in the kind of environmental and sort of human archival violence on this site, but that have resulted in the degradation of the landscape, but also the loss of agency of the inhabitants and sort of community around this site. So for example, looking at the 2050 flood map, which is a kind of future projection, nonetheless indexes a kind of original edge of the Harlem River here. a kind of prehistory of the site that was a Lenape trading ground at the edge of the water, and also then a kind of shared communal farming territory by the very early residents of the village of Harlem, okay? And so really examining the physical and political layers of the ground, including the kind of legal structures and codes, and finally speculating on what forms of community may have flourished here before the commissioner's grid of Manhattan came north, helped to start to understand the new environmental and cultural imaginaries for restoring the water's edge in this case, but also proposing kind of living memorials and kind of residential civic programs here. And so this is a view of the kind of the MTA bus depot, which is still currently on the site, really right over top of this sort of large African burial ground site. And so these are just a couple slides from the Harlem African Burial Ground Task Force's website that sort of show an aerial view of kind of what is at stake here through this proposed development by the EDC. Is to really take that entire block and convert it into a sort of mixed use development, including commercial, cultural, living memorial, public space, and mixed income housing. So how does one do that? How does the sort of presence of those programs on this site provoke a different way of thinking about design, and how a living memorial might kind of pervade even into those other programs is what I've been asking myself. And so these are just some historical maps of that original Lenape path, trading path, which sort of culminated at that space along the water. And so I really introduced into this research, scholars such as Marisa Fuentes and Saidia Hartman, who are experimental historians. And Fuentes in particular, who was dealing with also kind of resuscitating the subjectivities and the histories of, in particular, enslaved women in Barbados, who, I'm gonna have to go faster, who said that she had to learn to really look to other disciplines and speak the language of other disciplines in order to kind of re-image those subjects, including the languages of, say, geography or architecture. And I was really taken with how in this case, a historian's work becomes an imagination process. I had never really thought about how imagination is so critical to sort of pushing a discipline like history further, and maybe even historic preservation, or how we build on these sites. And I'm just going to go a little bit faster here. And so while historians primarily deal with written records, architecture and landscape, and this is, I'm showing now some images of speculative student proposals for that site that you'll see just kind of tracking. Architecture and landscape perform archival work through their ability to memorialize and or negate the past, present, and future of their surroundings. In this sense, architecture is not only a tool with archival power, but an archival project in and of itself. Therefore, might we consider ways that cultural memory is maintained and preserved in mediums other than written text? Okay, so there was a series of other buildings that have sort of superimposed onto this site since its original sort of use. There was a Hearst publishing building here. There was an entertainment complex. We were talking about entertainment buildings. There was a military barracks. So there have been all of these different architectures which kind of affect the sort of memory of this site. In mediums other than written text, including buildings, landscapes, but also oral tradition, performances and civic life that happened on the site, social behaviors, and of course, the ground itself. So you're seeing on the right-hand side, and I'll show more images of this, these students were interested in how do we begin to maybe rethink what a typical ground plane is of a site like this and allow the river to perhaps re-infiltrate to its original boundary and have a more kind of holistic relationship to the site, which right now has this kind of flood, this sort of flood condition. And this is in dialogue with other living memorials. You know, many of you know the living memorial in Alabama. And so these are some images of that student work, which begin to try to think, okay, how does the living memorial perhaps infiltrate or pervade the entire site and kind of transcend an idea of a memorial as a sort of single static object, but rather a kind of series of provocations that affect not only the built form, but also the entire site, but even sort of policies and frameworks for occupying that landscape. Oh, am I not going ahead here? Oh, I am going ahead. Someone's doing that for me, I think, because I'm not so good at it. So these are just some really speculative images that these young people did, thinking about even the kind of, again, the really immersing ourselves in the water there. I'll just go quickly. This led to a series of other studios. Here's some more. This was a student project for the Harlem site where they really thought about trees as having kind of archival agency. So they proposed a kind of grove of trees, but also a kind of communal garden, which would be throughout the entire site. So there would be a sort of stewardship that would almost enact a living memorial amidst all of these different programs and not a kind of single location on the site. And then I'll very quickly, and so here are some images of that. And because I'm out of time, this is a clip of the stakeholders of the Reverend Patricia Singletary. She's from the descendant community up there, the Elmdorf Church. Also Marisa Fuentes, the historian herself, and other architects and students at that presentation of those projects, which also were presented to the then Commissioner of Culture and also kind of other community leaders up here in Harlem who have been working on this site. And then I'll just track very quickly through these images of a kind of second iteration of that work, which has been happening up in Kingston, New York, where a similar situation of a kind of forgotten African burial ground, but in this case, in a residential area, in a sort of neighborhood block, is part of this sort of youth community design effort to propose a sort of living memorial, but that living memorial in this case is kind of traversing multiple people's property. So what do you do in that case, right? It's sort of, it means we have to kind of think a little bit differently about kind of sharing that space and maybe even a kind of series of covenants or these are kind of really futuristic scenarios or new kind of agreements of how this might provoke a new thinking of in this case, low density urbanism around the kind of memorialization of that site. And I think I will maybe stop it there. And this is an image of the latest image of that effort up there in Kingston, where they restored the house that was kind of all this while on top of that burial ground site. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jerome.
Where do I go now?
Oh, you can sit here, yes. And we'll have our final presentation. Shannon is back with us.
Hello. Okay. I am requesting remote control. I don't know that I have it, but here we go. Let's see. No, continue. I think we got it. All right. Are you all seeing this?
Yes.
Yay. I'm sorry. Okay. So my name is Shannon Garrison, again, from Philadelphia. I work at the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and I co-manage the city's Cultural Resources Survey and Pilot Project. And I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes walking you through our planning process and discussing some of the things we've learned so far and a few of the challenges that we're working through when it comes to documenting and regulating cultural resources. And I will apologize off the bat. This is a text-heavy presentation. You're not going to see a lot of charismatic pictures of Philadelphia. You're going to have to get on the train and come down and visit us here to see those sites. But that's partially because as a city agency, when we started this project, you know,
there's nothing on the screen. I don't know if there's, it disappeared.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Clapped too soon.
Let me try this again.
We can see you.
You can see me. Did you ever see you did see the presentation for a second?
Yes, it's back.
Okay. You know, as I was just giving this like disclaimer, if it happens again, I can just talk you through some of these issues because, you know, this is something that a lot of the challenges that we're working through as a city agency are in part, how do you identify cultural resources in the city, but then also how do you regulate them? Because essentially the Historical Commission is a regulatory agency. So before we jump into that, just a little background. This survey came out of the mayor's call for a historic preservation task force in 2017. That was a response to an unprecedented number of demolitions that resulted from the adoption of a new zoning code. And one of the key recommendations of that task force was that the city conduct a survey to identify historic and cultural assets. So in February of 2020, the city was awarded a $250,000 grant from the William Penn Foundation. And that was to explicitly conduct a survey that was focused on intangible heritage, with the deliverables being to hire a team of consultants to develop a survey methodology focused on cultural resources, and then to conduct a pilot project to test that methodology in the field. So, of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. And so a planning process that we initially envisioned would take maybe 5 or 6 months has since stretched out to well over a year. And during that time, we were readjusting to our new virtual lives and also really reevaluating this cultural resources survey project and how to progress in the wake of the pandemic, of the murder of George Floyd, of the civil uprisings of the summer of 2020. And in October of 2020, we hired a consultant to help us write a request for proposals to hire a group of consultants to conduct the survey. So if that sounds like the most bureaucratic way to do things, I admit I too felt that way when I started, but really the William Penn Foundation and emphasized that we take time, and as much time as we needed, thankfully, at the beginning to really plan this project out. And we took that time, and it was, I will say, essential. I think it's going to have been essential to the success of the survey, in that when we started to interview RFP consultants, we realized immediately that we had a problem that we needed to address from the start. So to back up a little, the Philadelphia Historical Commission is made up of 6 people currently. We are all white. 4 out of the 6 of us have graduated from the exact same preservation program. And when we started to interview consultants, we realized that we were interviewing and talking to a lot of people that looked like us, who had experiences and expertise that replicated a lot of our experiences and expertise. And so we kind of hit pause for a second to think whether or not that was going to result in a successful reflection of the culture of Philadelphia. So we, in December 2020, hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Then we assembled an internal advisory team made up of representatives from different city agencies to think through some of these problems from the very beginning, before we even hired our survey consultant team, and to kind of rework the process. And so we decided to ask for potential survey consultants to submit qualifications in May of 2021. And then in September of 2021, when we finally did release our RFP for the cultural survey resources pilot project itself, we then asked everybody that had been qualified as a qualified candidate to engage in team building exercises, because we really wanted to see and to hire a team that was dedicated to a process that was inclusive and involved voices that were not normally at the table when it comes to preservation in the city. In February 2022, we hired a consultant team. And just last month, 2 years after we started, we actually have kicked off the project. And this summer, we will be sort of publicly kicking off the Cultural Resources Survey project. So you might be wondering what took so long and what were we really doing during that time. And I would say that one of the most important things that we did was develop a set of values and principles to really ground this cultural resources survey. And those you see here, analyzing power throughout the project, learning from failures past and present, maintaining flexibility, adapting to problems, being transparent and accountable, and moving at the speed of trust. And establishing this list has been a crucial way of keeping us honest and accountable about the survey project, both to ourselves and to the public. And another major thing we did is we rethought what the project goals were. From the outset, William Penn and the planning department did not want a traditional historic preservation survey, one that focused on architectural integrity. However, knowing what you don't want a project to be is very different from identifying and articulate what you want a project to accomplish. And so a lot of the planning we've been doing behind the scenes has been really thinking and trying to express to other people what the real goals of this cultural resources survey are. And you see some of the main ones here, and these weren't necessarily the ones that we started with. And, this cultural resources survey should not only identify culturally significant spaces, sites, or events, it needs to transform how the Philadelphia Historical Commission interacts with the public. We need to build relationships with communities so that they trust us enough to share their culture with us, and that they want to work with us to preserve and protect it in ways that are meaningful to them. And then lastly, we spent a lot of the time rethinking, as I said earlier, the whole request for proposal process and reworking it in an attempt to make it more equitable and encourage people outside traditional fields of preservation, planning, and architectural history to apply and work on the survey. So ultimately, we think the process was pretty successful in that we interviewed 3 qualified teams of consultant candidates, and we hired an incredible group with a wealth of experience in community engagement. And I will just back up and say that that was another sort of rethinking of the project, is that we knew that the thing that we are not trained as preservationists at doing, and that the Historical Commission does not currently do, is community engagement. And so when we released our RFP, we were very clear that we needed the team to be equally as strong in community engagement as in preservation and survey work. And so we think, the team we hired, that was one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, to hire them, is that they were very strong in engagement and relationship building and advocacy. And ultimately, all of this planning, the DEI work, has really made this project a lot better. Which is not to say that we don't still face challenges. Or that we have, a lot of answers to the best way to go about preserving cultural resources and, again, regulating them. There's a lot of people, both internally and externally, that have questions and concerns. We can get into some of those. I think a lot of those questions internally revolve around the issue of regulation. And if we're not designating buildings, or if we're designating buildings for cultural resources, does regulating their windows and making them have historic windows, does that make sense? What role do we as an agency play in those sites? Are we, by de-emphasizing architectural history, are we, putting important buildings in parts of the city that haven't been surveyed at risk? That's something we've been hearing from the preservation community. So those are all questions that are important ones, and that conversation is happening. But ultimately, the field of preservation is changing. It needs to change, and the city of Philadelphia believes that we have something to offer to communities that want to protect the things that matter to them, and taking the time to listen, to build trust, and to work through some of these complicated issues together will make us as preservationists and as cities better and stronger. So with that, this is just a timeline moving forward, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Shannon.
Really important, that and stories that need to be told in places that need to be remembered and recognized. So I think maybe just thinking of the criteria a little bit differently for community-based things.
Yeah, I thought the casita example is really fantastic to bring up a lot of those issues. I was thinking similarly, which I hope I touched on when I was speaking, that really structurally there's kind of issues built into the sort of methods of sort of preservation and legalization and protection that I think maybe need to be expanded to acknowledge other qualities or other kind of capacities that are not built into the structures, like a certain amount of time, certain kinds of architectural significance we recognize, we understand is legible to legal bodies. Other kinds of architectural qualities are not legible to sort of lawmaking bodies or historic preservation bodies. So I think expanding our vocabulary and then building a capacity with these communities to sort of speak these languages of preservation. I think that's, as an architect, that's often the sort of the issue, is that you have communities who are up against sort of the language of, say, zoning or preservation or development. And it's a pretty arcane language, right? I mean, so this is kind of obvious, but really people embedded to kind of bridge those gaps is really important. And then I think this is maybe, I think this is also kind of critical. Different kinds of archival languages, right? We have, what kinds of documents? What if there are no documents? So how do we create legal structures and codes and preservation codes when the sort of archive surrounding something is maybe less of a formal or kind of traditional archive?
So I'll open it up to the floor if anybody, we have time for a few questions. I will let you know that Shannon unfortunately has dropped off the call due to the webinar expiring. So we can't have any questions for her, but if you have any questions for Jerome or Elena, I'm happy to entertain those. Yes. No, okay, go ahead.
First of all, Elena, congrats on your presentation. I think this is my first time.
Here. Not yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Elena, I had to congratulate what your presentation did. This is my first presentation that in my 40 years of professional experience, I hear something very deep and very profound. That lead me to believe at the reinforced the cultural aspect of the low-income families that basically all Latinos suffer. And I think it will reinforce that part. It will reinforce the quality of life and a poor conception of the minorities. I think you bring character with these points in that issue. And I think I'm going to finish with that. I think you had to work in the architectural part because there is a crime in the Bronx. I'm seeing beautiful buildings to destroy, buildings that belong in Park Avenue. But even better, in some of the cases, but it has been demolished. I think you had to work in that direction. And thank you so much for your words, for your work that you did. Nice, well done, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's just important too, because the Bronx does have, really, I think to this day, where the Bronx has this reputation that, the fires, the crime, people are still scared to come there sometimes, so I think it's sort of like it's still 40 years later, there's still this sort of like reputation, but, it is great to make sure that the casitas and these other buildings that are there, that people can have some pride in their community. They should have pride about that. So something to work towards.
And Shannon has rejoined us, so yes, Victoria?
I wanted to ask about that, the celebration at the casita. When is that?
The Bon Planazo is every 2 years, and it's in the fall. And I think it was last fall. So the next one will be 2 years. But BOMPLENAZO. It's sponsored through Ostos Community College, but it always ends with a big jam session at the casita. Because literally, even the people who practice this form of music on the island know that if you are part of this scene, and if you have to come to New York and go to the casita, like it's just sort of the place where all of it happens. Like so, this little humble little spot in the Bronx, community garden with a little built, homemade built little house on it is sort of like the scene for this like music all across the island as well as the country. People from the West Coast, Bay Area, people come to that spot.
Yes, any other questions? Yes.
First of all, an excellent deep dive on areas that I think we don't look at. So thank you for putting this in the program. I had a question for Shannon. Municipal governments aside, it was a very idealistic endeavor you started, but how did you get the financial tie-in and the patience for municipal leaders to support what at first seemed a short-term project, but obviously took a little longer? Governments tend to ebb and flow. And how did you manage to keep everybody's eye on that final project?
That's a good question. I think the William Penn Foundation has been very generous with the timeline. I think that because we did we started the project basically when everything was shutting down, that kind of bought us everybody's goodwill in taking more time than we would, I think, ordinarily have been allowed. But through that process of taking time, I think, and through having conversations with different people, we realized that is actually like taking time is going to be one of the most important things about this project. So one of our values and principles is moving at the speed of trust. You can't rush trust. We have the Historical Commission hasn't been in certain places. So we can't just go in and say, well, we've got 3 years to do this, that's how long we'll be here, and expect to have people trust us when we say, no, but don't worry, we'll continue after the fact. So we've kind of explained both to other agencies and to colleagues within the planning department that we're very much going, as part of the survey process, going to be leaning in because we want it to last past this pilot. This is the new way that the Historical Commission, we think, should be doing business. And that means that you can't really put a timeline on it or a time limit, and some people accept that and they kind of get it, and other people sort of are worried, and I think rightly so, that is there going to be anything left to preserve if you take all this time? But I think just being honest is and asking for it has been a really important part of the project so far.
Do we have any final question? Yes.
Thank you all very much. And I'd like to put in a plug for education, particularly K through 12 and field trips. People aren't familiar with the community where they live, or they may know it for a specific thing, like you buy something somewhere, but not put it in any kind of historic perspective. So I know field trips are tough, but we're talking here about local field trips that don't even necessarily require buses or going to Philadelphia if you're in New York to see what's the Liberty Bell or Washington, DC, but just walking around your own neighborhoods differently than you would if you're playing or biking or going shopping with your parents. So I realize that involves education, curriculum, schools, a whole nother area to get bogged down in. That's not so easy to change. But I think if we can introduce some of these concepts at the earlier ages, when the time I get to your classes in college, they'll have known this stuff for 10 years and they'll be ready to produce new ways of thinking about their own communities that they want to preserve.
Thank you so much. And I'd like again to thank Jerome, Shannon, Elena for this panel, and thank all of you for participating today. We look forward to, as I said earlier this morning, this is just the beginning of conversations around these issues, and we look forward to carrying these conversations forward with you. We recorded today, we'll be putting on our website, so please share that with your networks. And we'll be continuing programs throughout the summer and fall, including our walking tours and other programs around these topics. So look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.